Hi Internet, welcome to the Grad Troyan YouTube channel. Before the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I managed to go through and beat all of the mainline Final Fantasy games. For me, the biggest surprise of the bunch was by far Final Fantasy XI. While I had originally written off the game because it was an MMO, I unexpectedly fell in love with Final Fantasy XI, and it has become one of my favorite games of all time. There's a lot of misconceptions about Final Fantasy XI. One of the biggest misconceptions about the game is that people think that Final Fantasy XI doesn't have a story, when in fact the opposite is true. Final Fantasy XI has quite possibly the most story content of any mainline Final Fantasy game, including Final Fantasy XIV. It's one of the most story-heavy games in the series, and honestly, the story in 11 is pretty great. Because there isn't really anything on YouTube explaining 11's story content in a single video, I wanted to make a video giving a brief overview of Final Fantasy XI's main story content for those who might be curious about what the game has to offer, but haven't taken the plunge into checking out the most skipped of all the mainline Final Fantasy games. Before I get into each individual expansion, I need to explain how expansions in 11 work within the game structure. Final Fantasy XI features 13 expansions and add-on scenarios alongside the base game, adding new music, locations, job classes, equipment, and other gameplay mechanics to Final Fantasy XI. The general rule for each expansion and add-on is that the new content, which is defined by a main story campaign for each expansion and add-on, is generally about the length of an average Final Fantasy game, meaning that if you include the base storyline for Final Fantasy XI, modern-day Final Fantasy XI is basically 14 Final Fantasy games combined into one. To put that into perspective, Final Fantasy XIV will have 5 expansions when Dawn Trail comes out, meaning that Final Fantasy XIV would be the size of 6 Final Fantasy games. There can be debate as to whether or not the story content in 11 is as good as 14's, but the point is that 11 does have a ton of main story, and this is not even including side quests with their own mini-narrative arcs. The main difference between 11 and 14 in terms of expansions is that 14's expansions need to be played in a very specific order, whereas in 11 you can, for the most part, tackle the expansions in whatever order you want. Another misconception about Final Fantasy XI is that it is impossible to play without other players. Modern-day Final Fantasy XI is very soloable, for the most part, as the game added NPC party members known as trusts that the player can summon to assist in quests, and the story is very worth it, or at least it was to me. I needed help for a few boss battles near the end of the last few expansions, but most of the content I was able to solo pretty comfortably, and Final Fantasy XI still has a very active community full of friendly players willing to help you out if you need it. If I ever needed help with a tough boss, I was usually able to find help within 15 minutes. There's no shortage of friendly players willing to assist you through the more difficult endgame content, but if you're feeling shy, there's nothing to worry about, as the vast majority of the game is very soloable at this point. So let's say you want to tackle the story content of Final Fantasy XI. About how long does the process take? If you want to do the base game just to check another Final Fantasy off your list, you could beat base 11 in under a month pretty reasonably. For me, soloing all the expansions and only getting help with a few bosses towards the end of my journey took me about 6 months. However, I was working 2 jobs at the time, and my playtime was limited, so you could probably beat all of Final Fantasy XI's main story even faster than I did. And if you really don't want to play 11 and just want to check out the story, there's a great channel called Korvana that has the cutscenes for all of the game's expansions, except for the most recent expansion, the Voracious Resurgence, which wrapped up its storyline in 2023. That's right, Final Fantasy XI released new mainline story content as recently as 2023. People ask all the time if 11 is even still playable, as if the game is completely dead, when in fact it has an active player base and a new expansion just wrapped up a few months ago. Like I said, there's a lot of misconceptions about this game, and I'm hoping to address some of them in this video. I'm not going to be focusing too much on gameplay mechanics, as that's what the vast majority of Final Fantasy XI YouTubers do, and instead I'm just giving an overview of the expansions, along with a roadmap on how I think you should tackle them. Though I will offer some gameplay tips at the very end of the video for beginners looking to begin their Final Fantasy XI journey. All the expansions in Final Fantasy XI are complete, so you don't need to wait for updates from the devs for the storylines to resolve. You can basically tackle them, for the most part, in any order you want. In fact, expansion cutscenes will automatically play once you've achieved a certain level of progress in base 11, so there's potential to approach these stories in a wide amount of ways. But what order should you tackle the expansion content in? Well, see that list on the side of the screen when you boot up Final Fantasy XI? That's the list of expansion content in order of release, and that's basically the order you should tackle the content in. Start with base 11, then follow the list in order. Rise of the Zilart, Chains of Promathia, Treasures of Aht Urghan, Wings of the Goddess, A Crystalline Prophecy, a Moogle Kupo a Shantotto Ascension, Visions of Abyssea, Scars of Abyssea, Heroes of Abyssea, and then Seekers of Adoulin. However, there are 2 expansions that aren't on the list, Rhapsodies of Vana'diel and the Voracious Resurgence. So where do those fit in? Well, Rhapsodies of Vana'diel was meant to be the final expansion to Final Fantasy XI, and its purpose is to tie together all of the other storylines into one grand narrative. The other expansions are, for the most part, standalone individual adventures that can be tackled in any order. Rhapsodies combines all of the expansions into one overall narrative for 11 and ties those separate storylines together, so they all feel like part of one grander tale. In order to play through Rhapsodies, you need to make a certain amount of progress in each of the expansions, and theoretically, you have 2 options on how to play Rhapsodies, either while playing the other expansions or after you've beaten all the other expansions. My suggestion is to play Rhapsodies in between playing the expansions because it does weave all of 11 into a single, cohesive narrative, and, more importantly, playing Rhapsodies missions offers incredible rewards that makes playing the rest of 11 much easier. The bonuses are so good that they're hard to ignore, like the ability to summon extra AI party members and drastically reducing the cost of teleportation. These bonuses are so crucial that I can't in good conscience recommend holding off on Rhapsodies until the end, even if narratively it might be slightly better to marathon it. The story of Rhapsodies works either way you decide to approach it, but the bonuses are so good that I recommend playing it throughout, but finishing Rhapsodies only after you've beaten all of the other expansions on the legendary side of the screen list. So, the general roadmap you'll want to follow is beat an expansion, play Rhapsodies up until you reach a hard stop that requires a certain amount of progress in the next expansion, beat the next expansion on the list, go back to Rhapsodies until you hit the next hard stop, move on to the next expansion on the list, and repeat that process until you beat Rhapsodies. After you beat Rhapsodies, you'll unlock the final expansion, the Voracious Resurgence, and after you beat that, you'll have beaten all the main story content in Final Fantasy XI. In the description and pinned comment, I'll have a link to a Rhapsodies walkthrough that shows you where all of the hard stops are, so you'll know when to move on to the next expansion. Guides are very useful for Final Fantasy XI, and I do very much recommend playing with one. I'll go over that a little more in the gameplay tips section. Fun fact, did you know that the dev team for Final Fantasy XI's base game was basically the same team that developed Chrono Cross? And speaking of synergy, I just released a video ranking all 11 games in the Chrono series. You heard that right, 11 Chrono games. If you're interested in that video, be sure to check it out. Okay, now that we've gotten that gigantic intro out of the way, let me give a brief, looking at the time code for the video, yeah, brief, let's go with that. A brief overview of each expansion in Final Fantasy XI in the order I think you should tackle them in. Oh, and for those concerned, I'll do my best to avoid major spoilers, but I will describe the general plot synopsis of each expansion. Cool? Cool. Let's do this. To be completely fair to the folks who say that Final Fantasy XI doesn't have much story content, if they're talking about vanilla, base 11, that was released at the game's launch, it's fair to critique the game's story as being minimal. It's not as minimal as other MMOs like World of Warcraft or RuneScape, but the ratio between gameplay and story is tilted much farther towards the gameplay side than any other main series installment. The base game of Final Fantasy XI has less story than any of the expansion content, with the exception of Abyssea, which we'll get to later. The basic premise of Final Fantasy XI is that a player-created mercenary emigrates to one of 3 nations, Bastok, Windurst, or Sandoria, and begins undertaking missions in their new nation to rise in reputation and rank. As the player's rank increases, so does the importance and difficulty of their missions. The story of base Final Fantasy XI takes place in a world known as Vana'diel, and is set in what is known as the Age of Adventurers, specifically the year 884 of the Crystal Era. 20 years prior, the land was ravaged in a war between tribes of beastmen led by the villainous Shadow Lord against the allied forces of Vana'diel, some of which is shown in the game's opening CG cutscene. While the beastmen no longer have the strength of numbers and resources as during the Shadow Lord era, they remain an active threat to the citizens of Vana'diel. As such, adventurer mercenaries are extremely common in this world, and are often hired by different nations to dispel such threats. And those mercenaries are also hired for a wide array of tasks. The player character is an adventurer mercenary who emigrates to one of 3 nations, Sandoria, Bastok, or Windurst. There, the player character undertakes missions issued by different gate guards in the 3 nations in order to rise in their nation rank, a symbol of their status in their nation, and to progress the main story forward. The missions begin simple enough, but become more complicated, dangerous, and difficult over time. As the player continues to rise in rank in their new nation, they uncover a plot by the Beastmen to revive the villainous Shadow Lord from the grave so that he can wreak havoc on the land once again. And it's up to the player hero to stop the Shadow Lord and his minions before it's too late. While the story quality varies at the beginning of the game based on which nation you choose to start with, more on that in a moment, the arc involving the Shadow Lord is actually pretty strong. The Shadow Lord himself is one of the best main villains in Final Fantasy. While I'm not huge on his character design, I'm a big fan of the writing of his personality and backstory, and think it's the highlight of Base 11. There's a lot more depth and dimension to the Shadow Lord than you might think, based upon just looking at him and seeing his name. And I love that even in Base 11 there's already some really strong character writing. There are some other great characters introduced in Base 11, like the Dark Knight Zaid, who is basically this world's equivalent of Batman. Another great character in Base 11 is Lion, a character so obviously designed by Tetsuya Nomura that it's not even funny. In Final Fantasy XI, for basically every expansion, the player hero will work closely with a female adventurer NPC that acts as a deuteragonist in that storyline, almost like a Bond girl. But it's a JRPG where the player-created hero might be a female and/or might not be attracted to women, so the relationship is always written in a way where it could be either romantic or platonic. I'll be referring to these characters as expansion girls in the rest of the video. So, Lion is the first in our long line of expansion girls, and while she doesn't get too much screen time in Base 11, she's a fun character that definitely makes the game feel more like a real Final Fantasy as opposed to an MMO with Final Fantasy elements. She basically disappears from the story of Base 11 after the Rank 5 missions, but she's a welcome presence when she's on screen. Speaking of ranks, let's talk about nation ranks. In Final Fantasy XI, there are 10 different rank levels, with the player beginning at the lowest rank, 1, and as they complete missions, they continue to rise in rank until they reach rank 10, the highest individual rank for a nation. Rising in rank means unlocking new missions, which means moving the story forward. Each nation in Final Fantasy XI has its own storyline that is unique to that individual nation, and you unlock more of it as you rise in rank. However, as the adventurer rises in rank, the unique storyline of the nation takes a back seat to the Shadow Lord arc. But after the Shadow Lord is defeated in the Rank 5 missions, the story returns to focus on the unique storyline of the individual nation. The Shadow Lord missions are nearly identical between the three nations, and in the original launch version of Final Fantasy XI, the highest rank was 5, and thus the final boss of OG Final Fantasy XI was the Shadow Lord. So technically, if you beat the Shadow Lord at the end of the Rank 5 missions, you've beaten base Final Fantasy XI and can check it off your list. However, the nation storylines really pick up after Rank 5, so if you're interested in seeing resolutions to those plotlines, I do recommend continuing up to Rank 10. While those missions were technically added in the Rise of the Zilart expansion, given that they are continuing the story of Base 11, they make more sense to talk about here. Okay, let's briefly check out the individual nation storylines. So, what are they? Well, Bastok is a nation primarily populated by Humes, Vana'diel's equivalent to humans, and Galka, a large bear-like race. It's a nation primarily motivated by industry and technology, and the story revolves around a lot of the tensions between the nation's two primary races. Galka, unlike Humes, are not born, but instead are reincarnated after they undertake a journey of rebirth, losing memories of their past lives in the process. One Galka, however, retains all of the memories of their race, and is known as the Tailkeeper, and their job is to keep Galka history alive. The Bastok missions mostly revolve around Hume-Galka relations, and the identity of the new Tailkeeper, and it's pretty solid. It's not super interesting before Rank 5, but it really picks up after that. Sandora is a nation that is mostly home to elves, a race known for their arrogance and pride as much as their battle prowess. The nation's story mostly revolves around a political rivalry between the nation's two princes, one who allies himself with the nation's knights, and the other who allies himself with the nation's church. But honestly, it's not super engaging, and to me is by far the least interesting of the three nation storylines. There's potential for a great story with this setup, but it never really goes anywhere. Windurst is a magical nation where its citizens live more in tune with nature than the other two starter nations, and is primarily inhabited by Tarutaru, a short chibi race with heightened magical powers, and Mithra, a race of cat-like humanoids with a 99% female population. The nation story of Windurst revolves around magical secrets kept inside ancient ruins, and it's easily, by far the best of the base game nation storylines. Unlike the Bastok and Sandoria missions, the Windurst missions are basically interesting from the very beginning. The scale of the conflict is more epic in the conclusion, and the writing is just overall stronger. However, by that same token, it's also significantly harder than the other two nation missions, and Final Fantasy XI is already a pretty hard game to begin with. I'm not sure I would recommend starting in Windurst, but I do definitely recommend playing through it. The good news about Base 11 is that you have the ability to switch your nation allegiance at any time if you pay an immigration fee. So if you want, you can play through and experience all 3 nation storylines in Base 11. But if you want to skip them, you can do that too. Given that Final Fantasy XI is an MMO, there is no requirement to play through Base 11's main story at all, as there is a lot of freedom in the approach to playing 11. But without playing through the base game, certain areas, items, equipment, and even gameplay systems are locked out from player usage. This is mostly a story-focused overview of the expansions, but I will briefly touch on important gameplay mechanics introduced in different expansions if I feel it's worth a mention. A lot of folks really want to know what jobs were introduced in what expansion. So, what jobs were introduced in Base 11? Well, you've got your starter jobs of Warrior, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, and Thief, aka all of the starter jobs from Final Fantasy I. Neat! But Base 11 also has several unlockable jobs you obtain from doing side quests, like Paladin, Dark Knight, Beastmaster, Bard, Ranger, and Summoner. Each job class has its own unique questline, but honestly, I didn't bother with them. I didn't unlock any additional jobs in my playthrough of 11, and basically just stuck with one job throughout the entire game, and the story quests for that job weren't super interesting, so I skipped them. I've seen all of the job story arcs on YouTube, and while some of them are cool, I didn't feel like dealing with the grindier aspects of unlocking the jobs or leveling them up from scratch to experience the story. And speaking of leveling up, let's move on to the next, finger quotes, expansion. This isn't really an official expansion, but given that this section of the game is basically a requirement, has its own storyline, and is longer than some of the other expansions on this list, I felt it was worthy of having its own category to discuss in this video. So, what exactly are the Limit Break quests, and why are they in the game? Well, when Final Fantasy XI originally came out, the max level a player could reach was level 50. As new expansions were released, the level cap gradually increased to match the difficulty of the new content, until the game finally reached its current level cap at 99. The Limit Break quests are basically level cap quests that need to be completed each time you want to break your current level cap, and you are level capped at every 5 levels. So there is a Limit Break quest to get past level 50, a quest to get past level 55, a quest to get past 60, a quest to get past 65, 70, 75, and so on until you finally reach level 99. The basic story premise behind these quests is that the adventurer meets an elderly martial artist named Matt in the city-state of Juneau, a location you get access to midway through base Final Fantasy XI. Matt acts as an aloof older sensei figure and sends the adventurer out on dangerous quests to push past their limits and become even stronger. It's a training arc, basically, the kind you see in shonen anime, and it adds a level of narrative to your character's strength progression. There's a decent number of cutscenes in this training arc, and I'll be honest, it's actually pretty entertaining, with some really good comedic moments. It's not competitive with the best Final Fantasy stories, or even the best shonen training arcs, but it's better than you might think based on the premise. It's not super long story-wise, and the total length of the entire series of quests is about the length of some of the shorter expansions. That said, if you're soloing Final Fantasy XI, this is some of the most insanely difficult content you'll encounter in your entire playthrough of the game. Because you hit hard level caps, each new Limit Break quest is built to be at the maximum difficulty for whatever level you are at, and there's no way to grind out of the difficulty. It's a bunch of brutally hard quests that will make you feel like Indiana Jones, the way you're rushing through temples and desperately trying to survive against some of the most fearsome enemies you'll encounter. It's some of the hardest content in any mainline Final Fantasy game, and if you want to reach level 99, you've got to do it. Personally, I suggest getting this section out of the way as soon as you can. Continually stopping progress in whatever expansion you're playing through whenever you hit a level cap is a momentum killer. And if you level to 99, you can solo the vast majority of 11's content pretty reasonably. And I find the game flows much better if you just get to 99 and then plow through the rest of the story. Well, get to level 99 in your main job, and then grind your sub-job to level 50 for the stat bonuses and skills it provides. If you get all of this out of the way at once, you won't be constantly derailed by needing to do these quests and grinding all the time. There are some who complain that this approach makes 11 too easy, but again, I think the game flows much better this way, and there's still plenty of challenge to be found. Beyond just doing the level cap quests, you'll also need to continue to fight stronger and stronger monsters in order to level up, because as you get to higher levels, weaker enemies will stop providing you with EXP. I've got a list of great leveling spots that I'll post in the description and a pinned comment that I highly recommend using, as the difficulty to EXP given balance is basically perfect. If you want to get to level 99 before tackling the other expansions, which is something I recommend for better game flow, you'll need to hit up some leveling spots that aren't in Base 11, and thus that means you'll need to unlock leveling areas in later expansions like Treasures of Aht Urghan and Secrets of Adoulin, which means playing the very beginning of them in order to unlock those excellent grinding spots. Again, this is completely worth it for the stat increases. My recommendation is playing into those expansions just long enough to unlock those grinding spots, return to the list ordered in this video, and then when you get back around to playing through those expansions, just watching the first couple cutscenes on YouTube as a refresher before you dive head on into said expansion. But wait, there's more! You see, level 99 isn't really the level cap in Final Fantasy XI. Well, it is and it isn't. I'm not going to get into job points and merit points, because by the time you get to that part of the game where you encounter those, you'll know what to do. But I do want to briefly talk about equipment. One thing you'll want to do as soon as you reach level 99 is get some level 119 gear. What's level 119 gear? Well, in Final Fantasy XI, as you level up, you gain the ability to wear higher level gear. And once you reach level 99, you unlock the ability to not only equip level 99 gear, but level 119 gear, which raise your character's stats to that of a level 119 character, and also increase the stats of your trusts to that of level 119 character. So you'll want some level 119 gear as soon as you reach level 99. The first set of level 119 gear I recommend getting can be bought in one of the shops in Adoulin, which you will already have unlocked in order to gain access to the leveling spot. It's not very good level 119 gear, but it will carry you through a good chunk of the game. Your next set of level 119 gear that I recommend getting comes from participating in endgame content known as Domain Invasion. Don't worry, it's very easy to do, and is, as Basic World Builder called it, Baby's first endgame. As you progress through Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, you will unlock certain areas known as Esha and Reisenjima, and in those zones you'll encounter an NPC who can teleport you to a special area where an endgame dragon boss will periodically appear. If you want to know where and when these monsters appear, you can join a Unity Concord to get a notification in your chat box when they appear. But honestly, you can just teleport to all the locations until you find one, and it takes like 10 minutes if you do the random guess method. You fight the endgame boss with a bunch of other players, it's super easy, and then you get a special currency from fighting the boss. You can only do this once a day. Once you get enough of the currency, you go to a Rise of the Zilart area called Norg and trade some of the special currency to one of the other NPCs to obtain some higher level quality 119 gear that can carry you through most of Final Fantasy XI. You're only able to get the currency from these super bosses once a day, but there's no rush in getting this gear if you got the Adoulin level 119 gear. I suggest that once you unlock these locations in Rhapsodies, doing Domain Invasion once a day in order to save up for that higher end gear, as it's a quick and easy way to obtain some better equipment. I did all of this, aside from Domain Invasion, before confronting the Shadow Lord in Base 11. Basically what I did was get up to the Shadow Lord boss fight, did all my level cap quests and grinding, and then went back to stomp the Shadow Lord and finish the rest of Final Fantasy XI without ever needing help. Getting all my grinding out of the way early made the game much more of a treat to play, so I recommend either doing all of the level cap quests before you fight the Shadow Lord, or immediately after and before you tackle the rest of the game, as I feel the experience is much smoother. Okay, on to the next actual expansion. Rise of the Zilart was the first expansion pack for Final Fantasy XI, full of new locations, music, story, and gameplay mechanics. But it actually came included with the base game when Final Fantasy XI was launched in North America, as it took a couple years for the game to arrive overseas after its Japanese debut. In order to unlock Rise of the Zilart and play through its storyline, you actually need to beat base Final Fantasy XI by defeating the Shadow Lord and rising to rank 6 in your home nation, and it's one of the few expansions that requires beating base 11 in order to play. Rise of the Zilart is generally beloved by Final Fantasy XI fans as one of the best expansions in the game, but honestly, I think it's mostly due to nostalgia, and I personally rank it quite a bit lower than some of the later expansions, which are a lot more divisive despite, in my opinion, being of much higher quality in both a gameplay and narrative perspective. My biggest issue with Rise of the Zilart is actually related to its story, which I don't find to be that great, and is one of the weakest arcs in all of 11's main story content. Gameplay-wise, it's not bad at all. There are some very cool locations, some fun boss battles, and there are a couple of cool story ideas in there too. However, there are some major elements of the story that feel rushed. They're a bit awkward and don't quite work for me. Rise of the Zilart begins with a retcon of the ending of Base 11, and for me, it falls really flat, and just reminds me of the scene in Crisis Core where, spoilers, it's revealed that Genesis was in the reactor the whole time, just in another room, like off to the side, over there. But he was totally there, you guys, and is super important. Rise of the Zilart begins with a retcon of that level of writing quality, and it's pretty cringe and awkward, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of 11 fans think this is one of the best stories in the game, and I've had fans argue with me that the retcon isn't really a retcon, but you can decide that for yourself. So, what's the plot of this expansion? Well, immediately after the events of base Final Fantasy XI, the player adventurer finds out that the Archduke of Juno and his brother are actually secret princes of an ancient and mostly extinct race known as the Zilart. With the Shadow Lord finally defeated, the centuries-old brothers are now finally able to begin their plan of using the power of Vana'diel's crystals to open the Gate of the Gods and bring about paradise at the cost of destroying Vana'diel itself. Thus, our hero adventurer goes on a globe-trotting adventure to stop the rise of the Zilart. There are a couple of cool twists in Rise of the Zylart's narrative, and there's more story overall than Base 11. The cinematography of the cutscenes have improved, and it certainly feels like a grand, epic adventure. However, even though there's more story here than Base 11, I don't find anything here to be as good as the Shadow Lord arc or the Windurst missions, though I could see the case to be made that Zilart is better than the Bastok or Sandoria Nation storylines. The villains here have interesting Nomura-laden designs, and one of them, Camelot, often serves as the representative villain of 11 in other media like Dissidia. While he does look cooler than the Shadow Lord, without getting into spoilers, I just don't think he's nearly as interesting as a character, and is a little one-dimensional. In my opinion, he's one of the least interesting main baddies in 11, which makes his inclusion as the game's villain representative all the more puzzling to me, and I can only assume that it's nostalgia at play. The game's later expansions are far less popular than the early ones, and you can often hear 11 fans opining about how much better things were back in the early days of the game, before things got ruined with a certain expansion, which we'll get to later. So, Camelot is a beloved fan favorite from a nostalgic era of the game, but as someone who played through all of 11 in 6 months without nostalgia attached, it was kind of a letdown. Not bad, he looks really cool, but he's overhyped. So, this is the first Final Fantasy XI expansion, which means our first expansion girl outside of the base game, and the expansion girl is Lion. Again. Okay, so Lion being the expansion girl for Rise of the Zilart isn't actually a bad thing, because we don't get to see too much of her in Base 11, and it's nice to be able to spend more time with her character. One of the big highlights of Zilart is the amount of time you get to spend with Lion, getting to know her, and getting attached to her character. She set the standard for what a Final Fantasy XI expansion girl is. She's the OG, and she's a great character. So if you're a Lion stan, that's another point towards Rise of the Zilart. And there are some other really great characters introduced into this expansion, like the badass pirate Captain Gilgamesh, so yeah, I do see the appeal. As I'm talking, I realize that the appeal of Rise of the Zilart is less in the story itself, which is kinda meh, but more in the gameplay elements, music, locations, and characters it introduced, rather than the villains or overall narrative. Less than the sum of its parts, but a lot of those individual parts are good. Let's talk a little bit about some of the important gameplay mechanics introduced here. We've got 3 new jobs in the form of Dragoon, Samurai, and Ninja. Neat! We've also got our first battlefield content, which are basically just zones you teleport to and do a bunch of fighting to get some rewards, most of which have become irrelevant due to the current state of the game and power creep. Each major expansion basically has their own version of battlefield content, and honestly, you could do a full-on video about the differences and nuances between all of the different mechanics, but I don't really care about that kind of stuff, and don't care much about the battlefield content overall. That's more of the traditional MMO grind, and that's not what I play 11 for. I'm a story-first player, and while those battlefields have storylines, most of them I don't find to be worthwhile enough to engage with the tedium of the grind involved. I haven't touched most of them, so yes, I haven't beaten all of Final Fantasy XI, just all of the main story content. I haven't done every single side quest and maxed out every single job because I'm not an insane person. The battlefield content introduced in Rise of the Zilart, called Dynamis, is actually now a requirement for one of the game's later expansions, but luckily it's pretty easy, isn't that long, has a pretty cool story, and is actually pretty fun to play through. The idea behind Dynamis is that it's a parallel version of Vana'diel born from nightmares, and you play through dark hellscape versions of different Final Fantasy XI towns filled with monsters. It's just non-stop hacking and slashing as you go through Dynamis, and honestly, it's a vibe, and I kinda dig it. When looking at all of the battlefield content, I actually gave it a shot before it was a requirement, and liked the little of it I played, so I didn't mind going back to it to progress in the game's final expansion. Dynamis and other battlefield content doesn't count as full expansions or add-ons because they are included as side quests along other expansions and weren't standalone releases. And generally the battlefield content zones are pretty small with minimal story. But I really like Dynamis for what it is, and if I'm forced to do battlefield content to progress an expansion story, I'm glad it was this one because it was enjoyable on all fronts. You don't need to play Dynamis at all to play through Rise of the Zilart, and you really only need to play through it if you want to tackle the game's final expansion. But since it was introduced in Rise of the Zilart, I felt it made the most sense to talk about it here. If you want to play through all of 11, you could knock it out here, or just do it as part of the game's final expansion, as it does tie into that story pretty well. It's really up to you. Okay, on to the next expansion. Chains of Promathia, the second expansion pack for Final Fantasy XI, was released in 2004 at the height of the game's popularity, and is often considered to be the peak of Final Fantasy XI. The era in which Chains of Promathia was released is what many fans feel was the best era of 11 in terms of the online community and gameplay balance within the game itself. Beyond that, many fans feel that Chains of Promathia has the best story of any 11 expansion, the best locations of any 11 expansion, the best expansion girl of any expansion girl, and you get the point. Chains of Promathia has the best reputation of any expansion in Final Fantasy XI. The critics like it, the nostalgic fans like it, and newcomers also tend to like it. Me? I think it's excellent and lives up to the hype. Chains of Promathia is absolutely incredible. Even without nostalgia goggles, Chains of Promathia is easily a masterpiece of the Final Fantasy series, and I can't even fathom how much I would love it if I had played this as a young teen when it was a new release. Chains of Promathia is a top-tier Final Fantasy, period, and if it was a standalone game, it would be one of the best mainline Final Fantasy games. It's that good. The basic premise behind Chains of Promathia is that a phenomenon known as the Emptiness is found to be eaten away at the heart of Vana'diel. This force awakens the Worm King Bahamut, who declares that the arrival of the Keeper of the Apocalypse is near. At the same time, a mysterious child suddenly appears, and he seems to be tied to the Twilight god Promathia. As our hero adventurer attempts to uncover these mysteries, they find themselves on the Tavnasia archipelago, and discover that the nation of Tavnasia, thought to be destroyed in the conflict with the Shadow Lord, remains in conflict with the Beastmen in a desperate attempt at survival. Chains of Promathia's story, out of every Final Fantasy XI expansion, feels the most like a traditional Final Fantasy game in terms of its pacing, themes, characters, locations, and scope. It feels like a grand, classic RPG adventure with a great cast, plenty of dramatic twists and turns, interspersed with moments of levity and swashbuckling adventure, diverse biomes, a great new OST, epic bosses, the whole shebang. Everything you think of in a classic top-tier Final Fantasy game, all the essential elements, are here, and they're done extremely well. There are a number of NPCs you meet throughout your journey that, narratively, act the same way party members do in a traditional, non-MMO Final Fantasy game, and they feel much more like an active adventuring party than the NPCs of the previous expansions. As you recruit others to help you on your journey, it really gives off a classic FF vibe in the best way. The expansion girl this time around is an elven girl named Prish, a bare-knuckle brawler with a brash sense of adventure. Prish is one of the best characters in Final Fantasy XI, full of personality with a strong character arc. She's instantly likable, and the only thing that's awkward about her is her design, where she looks like a young teen, and any romance between her and the adult player character immediately falls into the ew gross category. Granted, her relationship with the player is written the most platonically of all the expansion girls, and is written more like a close friend than a romantic partner. And the flaw of her youthful appearance is only an issue if you compare her to the other expansion girls, who follow more of a love interest template. In a vacuum, there's no issue, and canonically, she is technically, spoilers, immortal and just looks youthful. Yes, it's the meme, insert the meme here. But her story is done in a compelling way, and again, she's treated more platonically than other expansion girls. But since one might be able to read a romance here, it's worth mentioning and critiquing. Prish is a great character, and arguably the best expansion girl, but the rest of the supporting cast is great as well. Omia, an elegant elven bard and Prish's best friend, is a great foil for Prish, and has an amazing character arc of her own. Tenzin, a samurai from the Far East determined to save his homeland from the emptiness, is fantastic and nuanced, and he might be one of the best Final Fantasy characters, period. I really wish I could talk more about Tenzin without spoilers, but trust me when I say that his role in the story is consistently interesting and adds a lot to the narrative. Jabos is an endearing Galka who lives among a mining colony of goblins, bridging the gap between beastmen and the unified races, and has one of the biggest hearts in the entire franchise. Luverance is a heroic elven knight who may or may not be keeping a big secret or two, wink wink. And Shikari Z, a Mithrin sin hunter with a one-track mind who learns to open said mind in order to save the world. Suffice to say the cast of quote-unquote party members here is great, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many great, memorable, classic side characters in Chains of Promathia, in and outside of the main party. The big bad of this expansion, Promathia, is your classic evil demiurge FF villain, and he's a satisfying foe to battle against, even if he lacks the depth of the Shadow Lord. Overall, the cast of this expansion is very impressive. Another impressive thing about the expansion pack is that the story actually changes the dynamics of global politics and trade in Final Fantasy XI through its reintegration of Tavnasia into Vana'diel society. The loss of Tavnasia in the Crystal War is a source of heartbreak among many in Vana'diel, especially in its sister nation of Sandoria, and it's been long talked of as being a fallen kingdom. So seeing that the kingdom survived and built up a new society holed up in a cave, fighting beastmen, is a heroic testament to an undying fighting spirit, and offers hope and jubilation as the rest of the world discovers that those thought to be lost ended up surviving. Often in MMOs, the world is left in a state of status quo, where things change but they don't really change. Like in Rise of the Zilart, where you go to war with the head of Juno's government, but that doesn't stop you from chilling out in the Archduke's palace. Chains actually shakes up the status quo pretty significantly with the addition of Tavnasia, and it's a welcome addition to 11's world. While Chains of Promathia didn't introduce any new job classes, it does have some of the best locations in any Final Fantasy. Not some of the best locations in Final Fantasy XI, some of the best locations in all of Final Fantasy, period. There's floating islands, there's creepy dimensional rifts, there's celestial planes of existence that operate on different levels of physics, and so much more. The zones in Chains of Promathia are incredible, and a treat for any fan of the series, MMO fan or not. There are some really great side quests in Chains as well, with some fantastic character writing, so even without new job classes, there's plenty to do. The quest structure is balanced well, with good pacing and a reasonable difficulty curve, with one noticeable exception, and has nothing to do with combat mechanics. One mission in Chains of Promathia requires you to climb to the top of a mountain known as Paradamo Tor, and it is absolutely absurd. The mountain has a very specific path you need to climb to reach its peak that isn't intuitive in the slightest, requiring very delicate and careful movement from your character. If you make even the slightest mistake, you'll fall all the way back to the bottom and need to climb back up again. It's incredibly nerve-inducing because of how easy it is to mess up, and is the peak example of the devs making 11 hard for the lulz. It's a requirement to progress with the main story of the expansion, and thankfully you only need to do it once. I recommend watching a YouTube video and pausing throughout as you follow the path of the video, because it's very unintuitive, and I can't imagine how long it would take to figure it out without a guide. But, that said, there's a certain charm to the fact that Paradamo Tor is a requirement to beat the expansion, and I won't lie, I felt pretty satisfied after reaching the top. Plus, with the help of that video, I was able to do it on my first try. I'm just glad we'll never have to climb that thing again. Overall, Chains of Promathia is a top-tier Final Fantasy experience. It's a grand adventure with a global scale, fantastic lore, well-written characters, great music, interesting locations, satisfying gameplay, an epic final boss, and a very strong narrative. This feels closest to a mainline Final Fantasy game in terms of narrative out of all the expansions. And if this was base 11, I feel like Final Fantasy XI's story would be much more fondly remembered by the general Final Fantasy community. If you want a single Final Fantasy XI expansion to give the feeling of a mainline FF game, this is probably your best bet. And it's one of the best expansions in the game. If you decide to play just enough of the game to do the level quests and beat Chains of Promathia, you could totally do that and skip over most of Base 11 and Rise of the Zilart. The option is there. However, if you complete both Rise of the Zilart and Chains of Promathia, you are able to unlock a special mission that acts as an epilogue to both expansions, and it does add some nice closure to Zilart in particular. All in all, Chains of Promathia is an all-time classic Final Fantasy game, and is probably the most well-regarded part of Final Fantasy XI from both fans and critics alike. It's absolutely worth the price of admission and worth your time. Alright, let's move on to the next expansion. Treasures of Aht Urghan, Final Fantasy XI's third expansion pack, was released in 2006 at the height of the game's popularity. Final Fantasy XI was riding strong with the critical and commercial success of Chains of Promathia, and the game was more popular than ever among fans. It was XI's golden age, and while Treasures of Aht Urghan isn't as fondly remembered as its predecessor, it's still a nostalgic title for many 11 fans, and is generally held in high regard. Just not Chains of Promathia levels of high regard. This is the beginning of the era of fans starting to fall off the game, and it's the first of several expansions where fans say that the game was ruined. I'll get into more details in regards to the specifics of each breaking point in 11's community, but in regards to Treasures, the folks who argue that the game just wasn't the same anymore are just upset that people got too busy with life to keep playing 11 year after year. Treasures didn't alter core gameplay or break balancing in such a way for it to receive negative feedback. It offered new jobs, great new locations, a great main campaign, and plenty of side quests. It's just that people stopped playing 11 because MMO popularity and life cycles wane. So as the population started to dwindle, some fans blamed the new expansion and don't consider it to be true Final Fantasy XI. I think this is a really dumb take in general, and I'll have to address it a couple more times in this video, but I think it's a particularly dumb stance to take with this expansion, and luckily, it's a minority position even among Final Fantasy XI fans. However, there are some private servers, pirate servers, that allow you to play a pre-Treasures version of 11 to get the quote-unquote pure Final Fantasy XI experience. There are several different private servers that each offer what they claim is the true Final Fantasy XI experience before the game got ruined by new expansions. Which expansion ruined the game tends to vary depending on who you ask. And while Treasures is usually lumped in with the true era of Final Fantasy XI, there are some fans who snub it, and it's really the first one where this trend starts to take place. The thing about the expansion content in 11 is that basically all of it is optional. If you don't want to use the quality of life updates like trusts and teleports, you don't need to. If you don't want advanced gear, you can use the gear from earlier expansions. If you don't like certain expansion storylines, you can just not do them and not go to those areas. If you complain about a lack of community, well, convince your friends to play with you. If you complain about the level cap, well, then don't do the level cap quests. In my opinion, Private 11 servers are just the game with less content, more elitism, and is a surefire way to kill the real game because it cuts off support for the devs who continue to make content to this day. I'm sure some of the players on those private servers are cool people, but conceptually I think it's dumb because, again, everything new that ruined the game is easily avoided, and all the things that people like about OG 11 are still in the game. They haven't been removed, it's just that the game added quality of life features. How terrible! Again, most 11 fans generally like Treasures, and most pirate servers include Treasures content, but given that some intentionally removed the expansion, it was worth mentioning. Sorry. The private servers removing content thing really bugs me as a story-first player, because I really like the stories of some of the controversial expansions. But speaking of story, what's Treasures of Aht Urghan about? Treasures of Aht Urghan is about our hero adventurer taking a boat ride eastward to the xenophobic Aht Urghan Empire, who have finally opened their borders to the Middlelands after years of self-imposed isolation. The leaders of the Middlelands are skeptical about the Empire's intentions and send ambassadors, along with our hero, to gauge the Empire's motivations behind their new border policies. Our hero takes on the guise of an adventurer for hire with the local mercenary agency Salahim Sentinels and finds themselves slowly making their way into the good graces of Upper Aht Urghan society. While there, our hero adventurer learns about the Empire's many secrets and hidden treasures, the life-giving astral candescence, the Dark Rider Odin, the mighty Alexander, ghost pirates, robots, and more. Treasures of Aht Urghan is an interesting Final Fantasy experience because in some ways, it feels like a Final Fantasy side quest storyline that got blown up to the scale of a full-blown mainline game, and it's kinda rad because of it. There aren't really a lot of RPGs with a Middle Eastern vibe, and the fact that the adventure is confined to one region of the world makes it feel like a smaller and more intimate conflict. There's more of a focus on politics and societal structure, like Final Fantasy Tactics or 12, but there's a lot more levity than either of those entries. What results is an overall more light-hearted Final Fantasy adventure that feels smaller in scale at the beginning, but still reaches the epic heights the series is known for, has all of the great melodrama you'd want, and feels like a full-length mainline title, but with a slightly different flavor. There's plenty of drama in this expansion, but there's a lot more comedy than any of the previous ones, and it's really hilarious. I love the vibe of this expansion, focusing on a particular region and really exploring that culture. For 14 fans, this is basically Stormblood done right, at least from what I can tell from story summaries I've seen at that expansion and what I played of Treasures. It's a regional conflict with a central hub location, but seems to offer a lot more fun to the adventure than Stormblood did, and it's a good change of pace after Chains of Promathia. It's not as good as Chains of Promathia, sure, but Treasures of Aht Urghan complements it well. A lot of the comedy in the expansion comes from its cast. Naja Salahim, the leader of the mercenary group Salahim Sentinels, is an absolutely hilarious character, and it's always great seeing her on screen. She's definitely one of the funniest Final Fantasy characters, with her short-sighted greediness and quick temper, and she's a fearsome fighter to boot. Classic FF character. Gesho, a beastman mercenary who allies himself with humans, is able to balance comedy and drama extremely well. This is also the first expansion that gives us a lot of screen time with fan-favorite Shantotto, a mad scientist black mage from Windurst, who is kinda a villain but doesn't do anything too bad, so the people of Windurst just let her do whatever she wants because it's better than causing conflict with her. She's even funnier than Naja and has one of the highest power levels of any character in the 11 verse. Shantotto alone could probably solve most of the problems in Vana'diel, but she's too busy trolling and doing weird experiments to care. She's rad, and there's a reason why she is often the representative of 11 in spin-off media. She's an incredible character, and her sidekick for this arc, the Robot King of Hearts, is freaking hilarious as well and has some of the best lines in the game. Our expansion girl for this game is Empress Nashmira of Aht Urghan. She's a princess who regularly sneaks out of the palace to go on rad adventures alongside her robot sidekicks. While she's competent on the battlefield, she has a soft heart and is an all-around good, caring person. Her personality isn't as strong as Prish or even Lion, but she's a very likable character. As far as villains go, the hero character is constantly finding themselves shifting between different factions, and so someone may start as an ally, then become an enemy, then become an ally again, and then a villain again, and it's hard to say who the villain is without major spoilers. I'll just say that Razhad, Grand Vizier of Aht Urghan, and brother to Empress Nasmira, is a great character, as is the dreaded pirate Luzaf, and their evolutions throughout the narrative are excellent. I can say who the final boss is, as it's not that much of a spoiler. It's the summon Alexander. Alexander is the final boss of the expansion, and he's freaking rad. Treasures of Aht Urghan has one of the best final boss themes in the entire Final Fantasy series. It's incredibly epic, pure hype, and it adds a lot to making the final battle feel so much grander. Probably my favorite final boss thus far in these expansions, just for the theme song alone. Treasures of Aht Urghan offers plenty of cool locations to explore, like the capital city, an underwater research facility from a past civilization, FF8 vibes, a ghost pirate ship graveyard, FF5 vibes, jungles, volcanoes, and a lot more. There are some annoyances with travel in this expansion, as some of the map design can be a bit confusing even by Final Fantasy XI standards, and you'll have to be creative with how you traverse between locales, but overall, the new areas are excellent. This expansion is one of the most cutscene heavy of the bunch, partially because a lot of the filler content in the expansion has become optional. When the game launched, it required playing through a good chunk of this expansion's battlefield content, but since it didn't add to the main story and required a lot of involvement from other players, it has now become completely optional, so you can fly through this expansion at a crisp, Chrono Trigger-esque pace. In terms of new jobs, Treasures of Aht Urghan provided us with 3: Puppet Master, Corsair, aka Pirate, and Blue Mage. The storylines for Corsair and Blue Mage are actually pretty decent if you want to pursue those job classes, and I hear that Blue Mage is pretty OP. In terms of in-game lore, Blue Mage is probably the most interesting job class in all of Final Fantasy XI, and the lore for Blue Mage in the game is more interesting than the lore for Blue Mage in any other game in the series. Basically, Blue Mages get their powers from consuming the bodies and souls of other creatures, but at the cost of mutating their body and slowly destroying their humanity, gradually becoming more and more monstrous. Anyway, the Empire employs a bunch of Blue Mages in their military, so yeah, Blue Mages are a bit yikesy. Speaking of yikesy Blue Mages, there's a high-ranking Blue Mage named Rauban, who is a close advisor to Razhad the Vizier. Bet you didn't know that Rauban in Final Fantasy XIV was named after a character from Final Fantasy XI, did ya? The Rauban in this game is very different, and in some ways more compelling because of what a creepy psycho he is. Great character, absolutely terrifying. There are some really great side quests in Treasures of Aht Urghan, including a hilarious one that offers one of the first openly gay romances in RPGs. There's plenty to do in this expansion, and overall it's a great time. So, overall, Treasures of Aht Urghan is a great Final Fantasy XI experience. It's fun, creative, has a great story that leans a bit more into comedy while still offering plenty of drama, has great characters, great locations, is a brisk playthrough, and offered some fun new job classes to 11. It's not quite as good as Chains, but it's not a giant step down either. Rather, it's more of a sidestep, offering a grand Final Fantasy-sized adventure with a different context and focus, and it's an overall excellent experience. Okay, let's move on to the next expansion. Wings of the Goddess was released in 2007 and is the 4th expansion pack to Final Fantasy XI. It's another mildly controversial expansion among some corners of the 11 community, and it's for all the exact same reasons as Treasures. But because it came out even later, less players have nostalgia for it, and complain that the game was better without it. It's actually somewhat amusing the hatred these expansions get. One, because they are actually good, and it's more a reflection of where 11 players were at in their personal lives than the quality of the content. And 2, because of how easy it is to ignore the content in these expansions if you don't want to engage with them. In Aht Urghan, you literally had to take a boat to an entirely separate continent. And in Wings of the Goddess, you can't just accidentally stumble into any of the zones, because it involves the player literally hopping into a portal to travel backwards in time. That's right, we've got a time travel story in Final Fantasy XI. Wings of the Goddess is a time travel story about the hero-player adventurer traveling back in time to the era of the infamous Crystal War, where the allied forces of Vana'diel battled against the Shadow Lord and his Beastmen armies. A villain from another timeline has gathered together the forces of darkness to ensure that the allied forces lose in their conflict against the Shadow Lord, and it's up to the hero adventurer and their companions to stop the forces of darkness from destroying Vana'diel's past and, in turn, its future. Wings of the Goddess is, by far, the most massive expansion pack in Final Fantasy XI, and it's not even close. While there is a single, main, overarching Wings of the Goddess storyline, there are also 3 storylines for the 3 starter nations, Bastok, Windurst, and Sandoria, and all 4 of these storylines are the length of an average FF game. In order to progress through the main story campaign of Wings of the Goddess, you need to complete at least one of the storylines of the 3 major nations, but here's the thing. All 3 nation storylines are really, really great, so you'll want to do them all. This is honestly some of the best story content in the entire Final Fantasy series, and if Wings of the Goddess by itself was a standalone FF game, it would be up there with Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy VI, and Final Fantasy X in terms of narrative quality. Seriously. This is the absolute peak of the series in terms of writing, and it's absolutely incredible. The general gameplay cycle in Wings of the Goddess revolves around alternating between main story missions and nation missions. You unlock main story missions from doing nation missions, and you unlock nation missions from doing main story missions. So, the gameplay loop is doing a few missions in the main story to unlock new nation missions, do a few nation missions to unlock new main story missions, and going back and forth until you complete the main story, as the nation missions will wrap up first. I ended up playing all 3 nation missions at the same time, which is totally optional, but it led to me really appreciating my experience with this expansion. The overall vibe for Wings of the Goddess is one of a world wrapped in the middle of a brutal, continent-spanning war, and it really captures the bleak tone of war better than any mainline Final Fantasy game. It's not completely without levity, and isn't somber the entire time, but rather it feels really genuine, in the same way that people in times of war would try to find ways to brighten their spirits. Beyond that, the scenario writing, from the character arcs to the military tactics, to the mythos of the time travel involved, is all top-notch, as is the extra backstory you gain for the world of 11 and the past versions of characters you encountered in Base 11. I'm going to briefly touch on each of the major storylines, not including side quests. The main story in Bastok revolves around tensions between the Humes and Galka. Frustrations with the prolonged conflict with the Beastmen and poor treatment of Galka citizens has led to revolutionary sentiment among certain members of the populace. At the same time, a mysterious serial killer known as Darksteel Hurricane has reappeared, and it's up to the hero adventurer to solve the mystery of the killer's identity and unite Bastok's disparate factions so that the nation can focus on the Beastmen threat. It's really cool to see Final Fantasy approach a detective mystery plot, and the espionage elements are strong as well. There's also some strong character work in relation to Zaid, who continually proves himself to be one of 11's best characters. In Sandoria, the plot revolves around a group of young elf children with aspirations of becoming knights. Dubbing themselves the Young Griffins, these children start off doing mostly symbolic and menial tasks befit of their age. But as they desire to make an actual difference in the war, they find themselves entering into more and more dangerous situations, facing the true horrors of the conflict, and being forced to mature into true warriors their nation can be proud of. The character writing in this storyline is insanely good, especially around the characters of Exenmel and Rahal. It also has a great comic relief villain in the form of an orc named Zogbog, one of the best characters in this expansion. The Windurst storyline focuses mostly on 2 mysterious black mages, Robel Akbel, warlock warlord and leader of the Windurstian forces, and his right-hand man, a rare male Mithra named Leko Haboka. Robel Akbel, after becoming gravely injured in a previous battle, now cloaks himself in mystery, while Leko seems to have come from out of nowhere to rise to high prominence as a fellow master tactician. Together, these 2 enigmatic figures find themselves playing an epic game of chess against the Beastmen armies, and one wonders what secrets they may be hiding and what their true intentions for Windurst are. This is by far the best storyline in Final Fantasy XI, period. Robel Akbel and Leko Haboka are incredible characters. The twists, turns, drama, and high tension in this storyline are incredible, and there's even time for some comedy and lighter moments as well. I honestly can't praise the Windurst Wings of the Goddess storyline enough. This is top-tier Final Fantasy, and even more than the other nation storylines, really captures military conflict and tactics better than almost everything else in the series, along with some phenomenal character work. The main storyline of Wings of the Goddess revolves around the player hero investigating mysterious creatures known as cavernous maws that have suddenly appeared in Vana'diel. Our player hero gets sucked into one of these maws and ends up in a dimensional vortex where they meet a creature called Kate Sith, or Katsi, who asks the hero to assist in the Crystal War of the past and stop whatever force is attempting to rewrite history. Our player hero ends up teaming with another time traveler, our expansion girl, Lilithette, a dancer from the present who seeks to change history and prevent her father from dying in the Crystal War. She's probably the best written expansion girl up to this point, with strong character motivations and personality. and she is constantly either driving the narrative momentum or adding a strong emotional core to the events unfolding. She's an incredible character, and even though I'm not super big on her design, for some reason it just doesn't do it for me, I adore the writing of Lilithette, and think her arc has the biggest emotional payoff of any of the expansion girls. The main villain of the expansion, Lady Lilith, gives off Ultimecia and Cloud of Darkness vibes, so imagine that general concept for a character, but with much better writing. She has a ton of personality, as do her henchmen, and she's easily the best villain the game has seen since the Shadow Lord. She might even be the best villain in the entirety of Final Fantasy XI, and is a definite contender for one of the best villains in the series. Excellent, well-written character that serves as a great threat and foil for our heroes. Wings of the Goddess does a lot of things incredibly well. The time travel aspect works really well in Final Fantasy XI, adding greater context to present-day Vana'diel locations and characters, and it's great to get to experience the infamous Crystal War firsthand within the game. The bleak war tone is captured perfectly in this expansion, and a lot of that is due to the excellent soundtrack. I haven't talked too much about Naoshi Mizuda's score in this video, but basically, he kills it with each expansion, and this is no exception. While he had some help writing Base 11's music with Nobuo Uematsu and Kumi Tanioka, aside from that, he's been doing all of the music for the game for over 20 years, and Wings of the Goddess features another great score from him. The music in Wings of the Goddess is a vibe, and really helps with the atmosphere. Just great stuff. The ending is also possibly the best and most emotional ending to any of the expansions in 11, so Wings has that going for it as well. Despite revisiting a lot of the same locations as Base 11, they are reorganized in such a way that they feel fresh and far more refined than the base game. Like, you'll be in Bastok, but the layout of the city during the Crystal War is totally different than in the present day, and it's the same for the natural areas you visit as well. The locations aren't as creative and interesting as the best zones and chains of Promathia, but I think the overall writing of the story is stronger here. The revisiting of old zones is one of the major complaints about this expansion, even though, as previously mentioned, they've been completely reworked, so they're truly different zones at this point, only sharing the name of the zone and some visual motifs. Another complaint about the expansion is that the rewards for completing missions aren't super great, which is a super MMO thing to complain about. But if you just want to play a good Final Fantasy game with a good story, then great news! That's what this is! Another complaint that gets lobbied at this expansion is that it's too long. Yes, it's long, but it's also really good throughout. Oh no, I have too much good content here. Dumb complaint. If the story dragged, it would be one thing, but it's constantly engaging the whole way through. Haters gonna hate. As far as new gameplay mechanics, there's some new battlefield stuff, as per usual, and there are 2 new job classes in the form of Dancer and Scholar. There are definitely some difficult gimmick fights in this expansion, and there are some required minigames that can be a bit tricky. But overall, the balancing I found to be pretty reasonable, and I really enjoyed playing through it. The 11 community is mostly positive on Wings of the Goddess, with some fans excluding it from their private servers. But overall, the general consensus seems to be that it's one of the better expansions, just not as good as the ones that came before it, which I think is mostly a nostalgia thing. Nothing will top Chains of Promathia in the eyes of the FF11 community. Chains of Promathia feels like a traditional Final Fantasy, and Wings of the Goddess feels like a Final Fantasy story with a heavy wartime emphasis. It's a different flavor that the series doesn't tread into as much, but it still definitely feels like Final Fantasy, and is peak Final Fantasy. I think that Wings of the Goddess has a better story than Chains of Promathia, and while I do think Chains of Promathia does have better zones to explore, the massive amount of incredible story gives Wings of the Goddess the edge for me, and ranks as my favorite of the 11 expansions. It's definitely a hot take in the 11 community. Again, I think the nostalgia factor of Promathia Era 11, the fact that you're revisiting the same zones from the base game, albeit in a different context, the lack of strong gear rewards, and the fact that most 11 players aren't story-first players are the reasons why they rank this expansion lower. But if I had a problem replaying areas in a time travel game, I wouldn't rank Chrono Trigger as one of my favorite games of all time. If you're playing through 11 for the first time, I imagine you will come away from Wings of the Goddess with a pretty high opinion of the expansion, and I think as time goes by, the reputation of this excellent story will continue to grow. Come at me in the comments, Die-Hard 11 fans. Okay, let's move on to the next expansion. A Crystalline Prophecy, a Moogle Kupo, and a Shantotto Ascension are 3 mini-expansions, officially referred to as add-on scenarios, that were released in 2009. Significantly longer than a side quest, but shorter than the average expansion pack, these 3 scenarios were originally released as a separate purchase, similar to the way that expansion packs were separate purchases, but unlike other 11 expansion packs, these 3 scenarios never had a physical release. It's essentially DLC, but again, longer than a typical DLC one might purchase for a game nowadays. There is some debate among 11 fans as to what counts as main story content, what counts as an expansion, and what counts as a side quest. Some fans will argue that anything that isn't officially labeled as an expansion pack doesn't count as expansion content. So I'm sure there will be someone in the comments saying these aren't true 11 expansions, and that if I count them, I should count battle content like Voidwatch and Omen. Again, my criteria for what counts and what doesn't is basically the list on the side of the screen when you boot up Final Fantasy XI. It's what Square treats as main story and expansion content. It's what most fans consider main story and expansion content, so I count it. And since most fans count Rhapsodies, which, I will remind you, leads to end credits, that counts too. And since the Voracious Resurgence requires beating Rhapsodies to unlock, and it's as long as an expansion, and it's been treated like an expansion by Square on the 11 website with a giant banner for years at this point, with its own OST of new music and new Battlefield content, it also counts. Plus, it's what's on the Wikipedia page. I know I addressed this earlier in the video, but this is the first time we've gotten to one of these add-on scenarios, and I've seen debates with 11 fans about this topic. These count as mini expansions to me. I beat them, so I'm going to talk about them. I know I probably sound super defensive here, but I've seen heavy debate regarding what counts as an expansion or not, and it's gotten really heated over very silly minutia. Overall, the 11 community is really great. Some of the nicest people I've ever met playing a video game, but there are a couple of Grinches I find I need to justify my opinions against. Final Fantasy XI was originally developed by basically the same team that led Chrono Cross, and the lead writer of Base 11 and Rise of the Zilart was none other than Masato Kato, famous for his writing work in titles like Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers, Xenogears, and Chrono Cross. He ended up leaving Final Fantasy XI after Rise of the Zilart, but he returned to write and lead these 3 mini-expansions. While I love Kato's writing and general game direction, in some ways these expansions feel like a step backwards for Final Fantasy XI. Kato had been away from the game for a while, and the way he approached the balance between gameplay and story feels closer to Base 11 than the expansion packs, which meant more tedium and more grind, focusing on mechanics that the game had long since put on the back burner, and in turn feels less smooth and fun to actually play through. In addition, while some of the storytelling here is great, some of it feels like the cutscenes in Base 11, which were less cinematic in their structure and pacing. That's not to say this applies to all aspects of all 3 mini-expansions, but it's worth mentioning. These mini-expansions each tell a different, self-contained story, and, in comparison to full expansion packs, are maybe about half or a third of the length of something like Zilart or Treasures. And there's actually a pretty sizable quality variance between the 3 of them, both from a narrative and a gameplay perspective. The worst of the 3 mini-expansions is easily a Crystalline Prophecy, despite it having the most promise of any of the 3 mini-expansions on paper. The opening movie of the game shows a pair of Hume siblings trying to survive a brutal Beastman attack during the Crystal War. The older sister helps her younger brother escape the attack, sacrificing herself so that her brother might live. It's a very dark, haunting, and beautiful opening to the game, and one of the best Final Fantasy openings period. The younger brother, Aldo, grows up to be a somewhat important NPC who helps assist the player hero in a number of expansion packs. A Crystalline Prophecy is the actual payoff and follow-up of that intro movie storyline. When a giant crystal appears above the city of Juno, a mysterious chain of events begin to occur all across Vana'diel, including the appearance of a young boy who mysteriously looks like Aldo. Aldo and the player hero go on a quest to investigate the meaning behind the boy's appearance, the secrets of the crystal, and the ultimate fate of Aldo's older sister. I have a very close relationship with my sister. We had a bit of a rough childhood, and the idea of a sibling doing everything they can to love and protect another sibling is something that immediately gives me the feels, and is almost a surefire way for me to resonate with the story. Frozen is my favorite movie of all time, and it's mostly because of how strong I resonate with Anna and Elsa. I adore the Magus-Scala relationship in Chrono Trigger, and it's made me cry on a number of occasions. The opening movie of Final Fantasy XI delivers the same level of feels for me, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Kato revisited this brother-sister theme, because the thematic concepts are delivered so well in Chrono Trigger and in 11's opening that it's clear that this is something that resonates deep within Kato's soul as well. Sadly, A Crystalline Prophecy doesn't deliver well on that concept and ends up falling flat. It's probably the worst main story content in all of Final Fantasy XI. The emotional weight of the material is lost due to a number of writing contrivances, too much filler, and lack of commitment towards establishing a new status quo due to the nature of the game being an MMO. I think this is a case of Kato feeling restricted by the medium of the story, and it's honestly a big disappointment. And sadly, it's not just frustrating on a narrative level. The mini-expansion has some incredibly awful mechanics, like being forced to traverse a high-level dungeon with your level reduced to 0, and without the ability to summon allies to assist you. I had no idea who thought these were good mechanics, but they're terrible. This mini-expansion is a letdown all around, and it's a real disappointment because Kato usually has such a high standard of quality, and this, quite frankly, does not meet it. I feel that Kato felt this too. Years later, he released the critically acclaimed indie RPG Another Eden, which for the most part is a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger. But the main character, Aldo, is on a quest to rescue his sister from beastmen. There's zero chance this is a coincidence or just a tip of the hat to his previous work. No, in my opinion, this is Kato attempting a do-over of an idea he can't escape because it means so much to him. And luckily he nails it in Another Eden, which is an all-around excellent game. Speaking of Another Eden, if you want to hear more about it, you should check out my ranking of all 11 Chrono games. Okay, shameless YouTube plug over, let's talk about the other 2 mini-expansions. A Shantotto Ascension is a storyline that focuses on fan-favorite character Shantotto, an eccentric black mage from Windurst who is essentially a mad scientist, also teetering on the edge of being a villain, sometimes ends up being an ally, but usually just ends up trolling everybody else. Shantotto has played a role in several other expansion storylines up to this point, as well as plenty of side quests in Windurst, but this mini-expansion finally allows her to take center stage, and it's a wild ride. The premise behind the expansion is that Dr. Shantotto, who had gone missing for quite some time, returns to Windurst suddenly with behavior so erratic and eccentric, even for her, that causes great concern with the other mages of the magical nation. Shantotto declares herself to be ruler of her own empire and begins a campaign of conquest to rule all of Vana'diel, forcing the hero adventurer into conflict with Shantotto and her minions, all the while hoping to find the truth behind the sudden and alarming shift in her personality. So, in Final Fantasy XIV, when an NPC is no longer supposed to appear at a location for the purposes of the story, they become invisible to the player character once story progression reaches a certain point. That NPC can be visible to other players at different points in their playthrough of 14's story, but they disappear and appear based upon each individual player's story progress. In 11, NPCs are always stationed in the same location, and Shantotto has a house in Windurst. Throughout this entire storyline, you can always just go and talk to Shantotto, which is a bit of hilarious cognitive dissonance in narrative design, but to the credit of Kato, he's able to write around this bizarre storytelling handicap and make the scenario work. This storyline is actually pretty well written, full of comedy, twists and turns, an exciting and hilarious climax, and is overall a good time. This feels more like the standard of Masato Kato writing, and manages to work well within the limitations that the game system set for a scenario such as this, taking a well-established character that is forced into a set location and still finding a way to build a very compelling narrative around that. I'm very impressed with the writing in this particular scenario, and it is quite good. Shantotto is one of my favorite characters in 11, and she's generally the overall fan favorite of most players, so a storyline centered around her is completely welcome. I like the idea of those weird Orochimaru type villain characters who hang around the heroes because it's better to leave them be than cause open conflict with them, and it's fun 11 explored a storyline around a character like that taking a dark turn. Gameplay-wise, it's not quite as frustrating as a Crystalline Prophecy, but it does offer one major annoyance: crafting. None of the other expansion content required the player to engage in the game's crafting mechanics, but in order to progress through a Shantotto Ascension, there is a mission that requires a certain amount of crafting. It's not just a matter of getting the materials to craft the item. No, you also need to level up your crafting enough to be able to successfully create the required items to progress through the mission, and said items are not able to be traded or sold to other players. If you want to do this expansion, you need to do crafting, and as someone who intentionally avoided crafting, it was a momentum killer. However, a small part of me is glad I did engage with some of the game's mechanics I would have otherwise skipped, and the rest of the gameplay for the expansion was overall pretty good. That, combined with a fun story, easily made it a much more enjoyable experience than a Crystalline Prophecy. While the 3 mini-expansions are lumped together because all of them were led by Kato, released at the same time, are around the same length, and focus on original game locations, it's clear when comparing a Crystalline Prophecy and a Shantotto Ascension that these mini-expansions each offer very different experiences, and, depending on your tastes, you'll find you will prefer some much more than others. Alright, let's move on to the last of the Kato mini-expansions. A Moogle Kupo stars another character the player hero has constantly interacted with throughout their adventures, but had yet to take center stage, their House Moogle. In Final Fantasy XI, each player in the game has their very own house, and in their house they have a Moogle who hangs out there, watching your stuff for you, feeding your pets, watering your plants, what have you. When your House Moogle notices that your house has a leak coming from the ceiling, a quest to repair the roof begins, but somehow ends up with the player hero performing an exorcism on a haunted house, exploring ancient ruins, escaping the claws of Mithrin cat burglars, and fighting against the Moogle Mafia. Oh, and Shantotto is in this one as well, and she's freaking great in this expansion too. A Moogle Kupo is shockingly great, by far the best of the Kato mini expansions, and honestly, it's better than some of the bigger expansions in my book. It's a very silly story, and it's very absurd looking at the chain of events as to where things started and the conclusion to where things ultimately end up, but that is definitely part of the charm of this story. It's off-the-wall bonkers, with a lot of the story relying more on a level of cartoon logic, and it actually works brilliantly. This story knows that, and plays it perfectly for laughs. Originally this was written as a horror story that Kato ultimately felt was too unsettling, so it was reworked into a comedy instead, and I'm so happy with the results. I freaking love this expansion. The pacing between story and gameplay is the strongest here out of all three of the mini expansions. The missions in A Moogle Kupo I believe are the most well-paced of this collection of Kato scenarios, hitting a nice sweet spot that feels closer to the quality of 11's more recent content than the pacing of the base game. Though admittedly, a Shantotto Ascension is fair competition here, as the pacing of that expansion was generally good too, but not quite as good as this one, in my opinion. As far as specific gameplay mechanics, this one, like the other mini expansions, is required to force upon the player one annoying gameplay element, and in this case, it requires the player go into certain zones and utilizing the mining, logging, and harvesting mechanics in order to obtain specific key items for the quest. All of these mechanics function almost identically. Use an item, a pickaxe, logging axe, or scythe, on a glowing icon, and keep using said item until it either breaks, you get the key item you're looking for, or the checkpoint disappears and you venture elsewhere on the map to find another one until you get the item you want. There's a bit of tedium in this process, but I found it to be a lot less annoying than the crafting mechanics of a Shantotto Ascension and the level sync mechanics of a Crystalline Prophecy. There's also a set of mini-games towards the end of the expansion that are honestly quite a bit fun, and the final boss of the expansion is one of my favorite boss fights in all of Final Fantasy XI. The music is fantastic, the mechanics are engaging, and it's both epic and hilarious at the same time. And after the boss battle, you have the option to replay it whenever you want, which is awesome. This one is basically a winner for me all around. A lot of people skip Kato's add-ons because they aren't quote-unquote real expansions, but hey, they're on the legendary list, and I consider them expansion enough for me to discuss here in this video. I'm glad I played all of them to get that full Final Fantasy XI mainline story experience, and for me, A Moogle Kupo is one of the highlights of my entire 11 playthrough. I think it's underrated, fun, funny, and a great addition to the game. Alright, on to the next expansion, and boy is it a controversial one. Vision of Abyssea, Scars of Abyssea, and Heroes of Abyssea were released in 2010 and are technically considered to be add-on battlefields and are the first paid expansion / add-on content to focus primarily on gameplay over story. While these are technically 3 separate expansions, they actually do all combine together to tell one overarching narrative with a final boss and everything. And the flow between gameplay involves moving from locations in all 3 expansions constantly. Thus it makes more sense to treat all of Abyssea as one big thing. Abyssea, unlike other Battlefield content, isn't tied to a particular expansion pack, and was released completely on its own as a standalone, paid-for release. Now, ordinarily Battlefield content is not treated like an expansion by fans or by Square Enix, but the fact that Abyssea was paid for and treated the same as expansions when it came out, the fact that it drastically altered the state of the game, and the fact that it's on the infamous side-screen list, makes this one count more as an expansion than purely a Battlefield, despite other Battlefield content also having some story content. So, right off the bat, we've got controversy. The level this Battlefield content has been elevated to, but that's just the tip of the iceberg with Abyssea. Abyssea is, by far, the biggest dividing line in the Final Fantasy XI community. Almost every single private server excludes Abyssea and everything that came after it, and there was a large contingent of fans who discuss how much better the game was in the pre-Abyssea days. It's the most common flashpoint among 11 fans of when they claim the game was ruined. Every other expansion after this gets the same complaints, but it's mostly redundant to talk about beyond Abyssea because basically all of the fan complaints stem from this expansion. For 11 fans who think the game jumped the shark, this is that moment for most of them. Okay, so what did Abyssea do to ruin Final Fantasy XI? Well, it raised the level cap and added new, better equipment that made a bunch of old equipment irrelevant. So gear people had spent years grinding towards was basically useless because there was stuff that was way better and way easier to get. That's literally it. Fans complained that the game balancing was now broken, but I find this argument to be absurd. The idea behind an MMO is that they are supposed to continually be adding new content to keep players interested. Adding new locations and new gear is reasonable, as is upping the ante on difficulty. So if they want to increase the level cap so that players can compete with the new content, that's a perfectly normal and reasonable thing for an MMO to do. Some fans will argue that the balancing was ruined by Abyssea, but again, Abyssea is an optional zone, so you can choose not to go there and fight higher level monsters. And if you're upset about the level cap being higher, breaking balancing for earlier game content, that also isn't an issue because of the level cap quests. You can choose not to do them and have your max level be 75, like it was pre-Abyssea, and just stop gaining experience. All the tools to experience the game as it was pre-Abyssea are still contained within 11, along with new content for players who choose to enjoy more of what the game has to offer. The haters of everything post-Abyssea purely because of new equipment and the level cap increase is an opinion I honestly don't have much respect for, and consider to be one of the silliest, commonly held opinions among 11 fans because, again, you can very easily ignore everything post-Abyssea with minimal effort. In fact, you have to actively go out of your way to engage with post-Abyssea content by going to Abyssea and by doing the level cap quests. And come on, do you really expect a live service MMO to just stop adding new equipment forever? So yeah, I think that entire line of complaints is dumb. Hashtag sorry not sorry. With all of that said, I do want to acknowledge that most of the people who complain about 11 being ruined at certain points in its life cycle all basically don't play the game anymore. Or if they do play 11, they are playing on private servers. If you're playing the official retail version of the game, you'll find that basically everyone there is pretty chill, friendly, willing to help out new people, and a lot of retail players absolutely love Abyssea and have nostalgia for it. Overall, the 11 community is one of the most positive online communities I've ever been a part of. I think the minority opinion of Abyssea haters just trolls me because it's such a shockingly bad take that I have trouble wrapping my mind around it. Hating an expansion because it increased the level cap and added new gear in a freaking MMO just strikes me as really, really silly. Now, if somebody had issues with the narrative and gameplay of Abyssea, that's a different story and a much more reasonable debate to have. It has the lightest story of any expansion, including the base game. Alright, we've been beating around the bush long enough. Just what the heck is Abyssea anyway? Abyssea is a dimension that exists parallel to Vana'diel. At one time, Abyssea was identical to Vana'diel, but the land began to crumble away and become overrun with hordes of fearsome monsters, leaving the last remnants of the land to struggle for survival against overwhelmingly deadly odds. Joachim, a warrior from Abyssea, meets with our hero adventurer and begs assistance in helping save the people of his dimension from the threats they face. Through the use of cavernous maws, the hero adventurer travels to Abyssea in hopes of saving the land from their dark and cruel fate. Essentially, Abyssea is mostly just an excuse for giant zones. Familiar locations from 11 and its various expansions are reorganized in such a way where they become new areas, reusing the assets to create areas for the player hero to go monster hunting. Abyssea is very much a vibe. There's no day and night cycle in Abyssea. It's forever tinted with a purple hue of twilight, and the music creates this bleak atmosphere of loneliness and desolation that fits perfectly with the narrative, making the locations feel distinct and very different from their counterparts in Vana'diel. The general mission structure of Abyssea revolves mostly around monster hunting special, difficult monsters known as notorious monsters, and finding them follows two very specific formulas. There are certain notorious monsters you need to hunt that will spawn on the map normally, so you just find them and fight them. It's easy enough, except for the fact that one of them is on the peak of that world's version of Paradigmal Tor. So not only do you have to climb that damn mountain again, you also need to survive a battle against a boss who will use the power of wind to try to blow you off the peak of the mountain you just climbed. The other formula of monster hunting involves you gathering key items, taking them to a set point on the map, and using those key items to summon a monster. In order to get those key items, however, you need to defeat some other monsters in Abyssea and get those key items to drop from those monsters. But in order to get those monsters to spawn, you need to go to certain points on the map and use different items to get them to spawn. In order to get those items, you need to defeat certain random enemy monsters in Abyssea and hope they drop the right item you need to spawn the monster that will drop the key item you need to spawn the area boss. So, It's best to think of these monsters as level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 monsters are the random enemies. Level 2 monsters are the ones you spawn using items you gain from fighting level 1 random enemies, and level 3 monsters are the bosses of the zones that spawn by using key items obtained by fighting level 2 monsters. By the way, this is terminology I made up and not the game's. So, there are some issues here. Sometimes you'll fight monsters and you won't get the item drop you need. You might be lucky and be able to buy some of the level 1 items from the auction house, but you might just need to grind for them, and you'll need multiple items for each monster spawn. So, you'll have to fight multiple level 2 monsters in order to fight a level 3 monster, and as soon as you summon a level 3 monster, you lose the key items you obtained. And that means if you lose the fight, you have to go through the entire process all over again. This is the first expansion in Final Fantasy XI where I asked for help from another player, because one of the level 3 monsters had a move where it would freeze the actions of any character that was in its line of sight, and my NPC summons didn't spread out enough where there was ever a chance at survival. After losing 3 or 4 times and becoming insanely frustrated with having to repeat that process over and over again, I reached out for help, and for the first time in my Final Fantasy XI experience, was in a party with actual other players, and we easily defeated the level 3 monster. For the rest of Abyssea, I soloed gathering up all my key items from the level 2 monsters, and then asked for help again from another player. And together the two of us did a marathon boss rush of defeating all of the level 3 monsters in Abyssea, as well as the story-necessary notorious monsters that spawn normally on the map, though I did solo the one on top of Paradamo Tor. I probably could have soloed all of these monsters myself, but I didn't want to risk having to redo them after my previous annoyances. And it was actually pretty fun doing a boss rush with a player who was extremely enthusiastic about getting the chance to replay some boss fights from years ago. The final boss of the expansion, Shinryu, offers a cool narrative twist that ties back into one of the other expansions and reveals the origins of Abyssea in a pretty clever way. Spoilers, it's basically an alternate timeline version of Final Fantasy XI where the heroes fail to save the day in one of the expansions, and the final boss of that expansion morphs into Shinryu after essentially destroying the world. It's a cool twist that adds some nice narrative depth to Abyssea, but overall, like other Battlefield content, the narrative isn't super strong, and is about on par with the story in Dynamis and Voidwatch, which again are just flimsy excuses to summon the player hero to a parallel world where they can just fight a bunch of stuff. To the credit of Abyssea, however, it feels closer to an actual expansion pack than either Dynamis or Voidwatch, because of how massive the Abyssea zones are, and how distinct of a tone they set, so different from everything else in the game, though Dynamis arguably has strong vibes of its own. It should be noted that Abyssea, like other Final Fantasy XI Battlefield content, does have a time limit for how long you can be in the zones, and it does take time for your timer to recharge. When Abyssea first released, it was clear that this was purely a case of padding to make sure it took players longer to get through the content, having to wait like 8 hours before you recharged enough to be able to go back into Abyssea, and I do really despise gameplay systems like that. However, if you've been doing Rhapsodies missions throughout your expansion playthroughs like I suggested, you will have obtained a key item that will allow you to essentially make Abyssea time limits irrelevant, so it's no longer an issue. All in all, I do think Abyssea is worth checking out if you're playing the rest of 11, because despite its grindy nature, it actually is a lot of fun. And again, it just has this very cool, chill vibe to it that is kinda hypnotic. The music and pacing of the zones combine together for a really cool experience. I thought I would hate it and was just gonna play it for completionist's sake, but I ended up digging it in the end. However, if you're looking to skip any of the content on this list, Abyssea is easily the most skippable, as it's not a requirement for Rhapsodies, Voracious, or really any other expansion on this list. It's grindy, there isn't much story, and you can get better equipment outside of Abyssea nowadays. However, I do consider it an expansion. It's on the infamous list, and I'm glad I played it. There's a lot of controversy around it, whether or not it's one expansion, 3 expansions, or not an expansion at all, and there's a lot of controversy around the changes it brought to 11. But taken for what it is, I found that I enjoy Abyssea, and I'm glad I took the time to engage with it. Okay, let's move on to the next expansion. Seekers of Adoulin is the last quote-unquote traditional expansion pack to be released for Final Fantasy XI. Released in 2013, this was one of the final games to be released on the PlayStation 2, and the last Final Fantasy XI expansion pack to get a physical release. While there's often debate among fans whether or not to count the Kato add-ons and Abyssea as expansions, there is fan consensus that Seekers of Adoulin definitely is a true expansion pack. It has tons of new zones, new job classes, a new main story campaign, plenty of side quests, new Battlefield content, new mechanics, a new OST, the whole shebang. It's also the first Final Fantasy XI expansion led by producer Akihiko Matsui. Prior to Seekers, all Final Fantasy XI content, including the base game, was produced by Hiromichi Tanaka, who was leaving Square Enix due to health concerns, though I think the negative reaction to another project of his, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, was probably also a factor. So, in Seekers of Adoulin, we have a changing of the guard in Final Fantasy XI leadership, but most of the community has a healthy level of respect for Matsui and can feel his authentic passion for the game. The general response to Seekers of Adoulin is mostly positive from those who have bothered to play it. There are a number of people who hate the expansion because it once again raised the level cap and added new equipment, and a lot of the vitriol that fans feel about Abyssea is also directed here simply because it came out after Abyssea. There's less nostalgia for Seekers of Adoulin among Final Fantasy XI fans, and thus a lot of fans rank it lower in their overall opinion of the expansion packs. Personally, I think the quality here is extremely high, and it's on par with the absolute best of the game, and I think any hatred this expansion gets is mostly just coming from those wearing nostalgia goggles. Haters online will talk about how much better the MMO would be if Adoulin never existed, but if you actually play Final Fantasy XI and go to the Adoulin areas, you'll find them to be some of the most heavily populated areas in the game. People who actually play Final Fantasy XI seem to like this expansion, as opposed to folks who say the game hasn't been good since 2006. Seekers of Adoulin raises the bar for Final Fantasy XI in a number of categories, like map design and cutscene animation, and successfully pulls off an incredible feat of pushing the game to its absolute limits in terms of visual and musical presentation. Final Fantasy XI has never looked or sounded better. The zones are all incredibly well designed and extremely fun to explore. The devs were able to strike the perfect balance of both upping the visual ante, but also not raising the graphical fidelity too high where it doesn't fit in with the rest of the game. The cinematography is the best the game has ever seen, and the OST literally slaps. Seekers of Adoulin takes place on the western continent of Ubolka. The sacred city of Adoulin is attempting to colonize the wild and untamed lands of the continent. To do such, they have issued a call for adventurers from the Midlands of Vana'diel to be recruited as pioneers, helping further develop the new continent. However, striking a balance between allowing the city to thrive while living in balance with nature is a difficult one. With varying opinions between political factions, our hero adventurer finds themselves caught up in a battle of wills between the highest levels of Adoulin society, the spirits of the wild, and even demons of the underworld. Narrative-wise, Seekers of Adoulin is definitely in the upper tier of Final Fantasy XI expansion packs. I do think the game falters when it comes to commentary on colonization, as in the world of Final Fantasy XI, there is no indigenous population the settlers are replacing, which is largely ahistorical in comparison to our world, but I do understand why the devs avoided such touchy subject matter and instead opted to focus on a man versus nature narrative. I understand that, but I do think it's the biggest gaping flaw in the story of this expansion. However, if you do accept the premise that this is truly just a story about management of resources and there is no displaced or oppressed population, then it is a very enjoyable premise, and one of the best written expansions in the game. The expansion girl, Arcelia, is quite possibly the best of all the expansion girls. She's the descendant of the founder king of Adoulin, and though the imperial system has been dissolved and her royal bloodline offers no authority, she is still generally adored by the populace and referred to as a princess. Arcelia's journey is one of trying to do the right thing in a world of moral grays, doing her best to help her people, recognizing the power of her influence, and constantly weighing her options on the right route to take. She's adventurous and fun, but also reflective and nuanced, and she's quite frankly an incredible character. Seekers has some really excellent characters, like the mysterious and flamboyant Theodore, the noble warrior Mormar, the fierce and loyal Darkullen, and the brutally ruthless Ingrid. The villains in this expansion are particularly strong, especially the henchman Balamor, who is by far the best villain in Final Fantasy XI that isn't one of the big bads of the expansion. He definitely gives off Kefka vibes, has a unique and unnerving design, and is definitely a scene-stealing presence. The main villain of the expansion, Hades, is another great Final Fantasy XI baddie, not quite as good as the Shadow Lord or Lady Lilith, but a better villain than perhaps Promathia. The overall writing of Seekers of Adoulin is really, really strong. Some of the most emotionally powerful scenes in all of Final Fantasy XI are contained within this expansion, including one of the most powerful scenes in all of Final Fantasy history. It would be a bit of a spoiler to talk about the events that unfolded, but the sheer amount of anger and sorrow the scene induced was one of the most dark and powerful moments I had ever experienced in a video game. It's kind of mind-blowing how good that scene is in the context of the narrative, and the thing is, the overall quality is pretty consistent throughout the expansion. It's a really good Final Fantasy story, but again, like Treasures of Aht Urghan, it's focused more on a small regional conflict than a grand, global adventure. That said, the scope and size of the adventure still feels like Final Fantasy, as does the quality. Seekers of Adoulin has tons of great new areas to explore, and has possibly the best map design out of any of the expansions. The city of Adoulin itself is one of the best cities in the game, and has become a great hub for many of the players currently playing Final Fantasy XI. Seekers of Adoulin is visually stunning and packed to the brim with tons to do. We're approaching on the end of content that is easy to solo on this list, and while a good chunk of Seekers you can play on your own without trouble, you'll definitely be wanting to ask for help for some of the tougher boss fights at the end of this expansion. Let's touch a little on some of the new gameplay elements added here. Seekers of Adoulin actually has a lot of unique gameplay elements to it that I find are worth touching on. First, the game has two new jobs in the form of Rune Fencer and Geomancer. The Geomancer job quest has a cool storyline about the Lifestream, which is also a thing in Final Fantasy XI, and it's a pretty cool throwback to see show up unexpectedly in this game. There are things called survival skills, which are required to traverse Obulka. You learn these survival skills through quests, so in order to climb, pass certain bodies of water, or destroy certain obstacles, you'll need to develop these various survival skills. A fun element to clearing terrain is that the game treats these events basically like battles, so you'll be slashing away at tree trunks and boulders the same way you would random enemies, and you'll have to balance ridding those obstacles alongside defending yourself from the nearby beasts. It's a pretty cool system, and it's required to progress the story, so I recommend just getting all of the abilities as soon as you can, as soon as you start the expansion, so the game can flow better. There is also a main story mission early on in the expansion that requires you to have a certain level of fame and to have used a certain number of imprimaturs on coalition assignments in order to trigger the cutscene. The higher your fame, the less imprimaturs you'll need to have used, and the more imprimaturs you've used, the less high your fame needs to be. If you grind out both, you'll initiate the main story cutscene much faster, and I do recommend grinding those both out early as well, so that the expansion flows better. Now I know you're probably thinking to yourself, what are fame and imprimaturs? Well, fame is a mechanic that has been in Final Fantasy XI since the beginning, and basically measures how many side quests and main story quests you've done in a region. There's a pretty easy loop of quick side quests you can do over and over again to increase your Adoulin fame. Coalition assignments are short missions you can take from NPCs at different Pioneer coalitions, but in order to do these assignments, you need to use an item called imprimaturs, which replenish over real life time, meaning you can't grind all of them out in a single day, and you need to do those missions every day in order to use up your imprimaturs. The higher your Adoulin fame is, the less imprimaturs you'll need to use to advance the main story mission in question, so you can keep grinding out your fame while you wait for your imprimaturs to replenish. This is one of those infamous timed MMO systems that detractors of the genre hate, and I totally get it, but honestly, all this hassle maybe adds like an extra day or two to your playtime. You can get all your survival skills while you wait for your imprimaturs to replenish, so it's not like you have a shortage of things to do, and there are far more tedious MMO systems out there. I do understand non-MMO players balking at this, but it's not as bad as it sounds on paper and doesn't take that long, and the rest of the expansion is basically grind-free. If you're looking for something fun to do while you're waiting for imprimaturs, are bored with grinding fame, and have all of your survival skills, you can always play one of the many mini-games introduced in this expansion, like the extremely fun Boom or Bust, or you could engage in possibly my favorite piece of side content in Final Fantasy XI, the Moogle Garden, a private beach paradise where you can plant crops, raise monsters, go fishing, and enjoy the ocean breeze with your Moogle friend. For the most part, I pretty much stuck to main story content in 11, but I love the relaxing nature of the Moogle Garden. It's one of my favorite places to hang out in out of all the places in the game, and it's a great new feature of the Seekers of Adoulin expansion pack. There is a metric ton of cool, fun, and unique things that Seekers of Adoulin adds to Final Fantasy XI. There are actually some private servers that include Seekers of Adoulin content, and just rebalance the game so that the enemies there can be defeated by level 75 characters, which I do like better than out and out removing the content, but in general, I still don't like the private server concept. It would be one thing if Final Fantasy XI was no longer online, and the only way for the game to survive was through fan preservation, like with Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 servers, as that is the only way you could experience that game nowadays. But that's not the case with Final Fantasy XI, because everything from the original Final Fantasy XI can still be played in the retail version, including limiting your level cap and not using the higher end equipment the game added. And as mentioned, all of the new content is contained in areas you have to go out of your way to get to. The fact that the dev staff for the game is still releasing new mainline story content as recently as 2023 makes private servers feel like a slap in the face to the hard work they're continuing to do after more than 20 years. paying the monthly fee for 11 pays for the livelihoods of the devs continuing to work on the game, much like a Patreon pays to support other creatives. And I hate to see their work disregarded by fans who assume they know better than them, especially when, as I've said before, all of the post-Abyssea content can be easily avoided if you really hate it. In my opinion, the most surefire way to kill 11 are the private servers, because they encourage people to stop supporting the game, and as more people leave the game, the more likely it will be taken offline. That's not to say that everyone who plays private servers, or even the folks who run them, are bad people. On the contrary, there are some private servers that seem to respect all of the game's material, and encourage people to play retail to support new expansion content. I admire and respect that, but I think I fundamentally disagree with the removal of mechanics, story, and locations. I know some will argue that because the game is more soloable, there's no need to party up and utilize chain attacks. But again, those mechanics still exist within the game. And if the point of playing on a private server is to find like-minded players who want to play that way, there's literally nothing stopping you from doing that in retail. I can understand and sympathize with the situation of not being able to afford the monthly fee. And honestly, of all the reasons to use private servers, the "I'm broke and can't afford an extra 12 a month because my financial situation under neoliberalism pushes me to my breaking point every paycheck" is one I can actually kind of get behind. I have no desire to simp for a massive corporation, so if your reason for pirating the game is poverty, I get it. However, I am willing to simp for the artists and creatives who worked hard on creating latter-day Final Fantasy XI, and I'm willing to stand up for the great storytelling they deliver. I'm for adding content, not removing it. I'm not against fan projects. Hell, I just did a video highlighting a bunch of great fan projects. I'd be down to play a Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 private server to experience the original game, since that story content is no longer playable. That, to me, is a fine reason to have a private server. If a FF11 private server created an all-new expansion pack, I'd be down to check it out, and I encourage that kind of creativity. That sounds rad as hell. But I just can't get behind private servers that remove content. To me, it's throwing out all the hard work the devs did on Latter Day 11 in the trash, and it feels particularly insulting since it's some of 11's best content. Overall, Seekers of Adoulin is a great addition to Final Fantasy XI. It's extremely underrated, and is on par with the best of what the game has to offer. Judged more for the era in which it came out, rather than what it offered to the game, and what it offered is truly excellent. Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, the penultimate Final Fantasy XI expansion at the time of this video, was released in 2015. Unlike other Final Fantasy XI expansions, which for the most part were isolated stories that could be played in any order, Rhapsodies was a story that was intended to act as a narrative finale to Final Fantasy XI, tying together the stories of all the other expansions together into one grand tale that served as an ending and send-off to the entirety of Final Fantasy XI as the game reached its waning years. It was the final expansion to be released on the PlayStation 2, the console Final Fantasy XI originated on, and the final expansion to be released on the Xbox 360 as well, as service for both of those platforms ended in 2016, leaving only the PC version of the game alive and active. While not technically an expansion pack, as there was no physical release and it did not require a separate purchase, the vast majority of 11 fans treat Rhapsodies as an expansion, even without it being on the famous side of the screen list, and the community is generally favorable towards it. There is a little bit of controversy around Rhapsodies in regards to some gameplay changes. However, the nostalgia love letter to the entire Final Fantasy XI experience was made with such earnestness that even the most cynical players tended to praise this finale to 11's story. The premise behind Rhapsodies of Vana'diel is that the player hero encounters a young woman named Iroha, who claims to be the adventurous student from the future. Iroha states that she has traveled back in time in an attempt to stop an oncoming apocalypse, and thus the player hero teams up with the time-traveling samurai in order to save all of Vana'diel. Rhapsodies is a great Final Fantasy XI story that both offers great new elements with characters like Iroha, while also offering plenty of nostalgic tributes to the entirety of Final Fantasy XI. Revisiting old locations, reuniting with characters from previous expansions, and tying together all of 11's disparate storylines into one cohesive narrative makes Rhapsodies almost feel like it's the true Final Fantasy XI, that it's the most important story in the game, and that everything else is just a part of the story of Rhapsodies. You could think of it like the Avengers Endgame of Final Fantasy XI, in a way, where everything gets tied together to add a nice, grand conclusion to the series. By itself, Rhapsodies is about the length of other expansions, but if you consider all of the other expansions to be a part of it, and this to be the ending of Final Fantasy XI, then it just turns Final Fantasy XI into one giant, insanely massive FF title. Iroha is a great expansion girl, with one of the more well-written and engaging personalities of the bunch. She has a great design, her motivations are clear, and it's really cool having a sensei-student relationship with another character where you, the player, are the sensei. The amount of respect that Iroha has for the player character leads to a lot of interesting dynamics throughout the story, and she has some pretty interesting relationships with some of the other characters as well. She's become a fan favorite, and for good reason. She's a great character. But she's not the only expansion girl in Rhapsodies. Nope. Lion, Prish, Empress Nashmira of Aht Urghan, Lillicet, and Arcelia are all here as well. All of the expansion girls, united under one storyline. All of the pieces of 11's narrative finally weave together here into a tapestry that feels intentional and thematically rich. It's so great seeing everything fall into place so perfectly, and really adds a lot to 11's narrative. Rhapsodies is a story meant to tie together all of the previous expansions into one storyline, so you'll be traveling to locations from all of the previous expansions, alongside venturing to a few new ones. Playing through Rhapsodies requires a certain amount of progress to be made in Rise of the Zilart, Chains of Promathia, Treasures of Aht Urghan, Wings of the Goddess, and Seekers of Adoulin. So you can theoretically just get up to a certain point in each expansion, not finish them, and then just beat Rhapsodies, but you'll get far less out of the expansion if you take that route. While it is possible to begin Rhapsodies after you've beaten all of the other expansions, it's generally recommended that you play Rhapsodies missions throughout your playthroughs of the other expansions, and then finishing Rhapsodies after you've beaten all of the others, because you'll gain incredible bonuses that make the rest of 11 much easier through playing Rhapsodies, like the ability to summon extra trusts, and reducing the amount of gil it takes to use teleportation devices. Some fans are upset about the Rhapsodies bonuses making the game too newcomer friendly, because that's a bad thing, I guess? Personally, I think getting more people to play the game, giving them more options on how to play the game, and adding quality of life features is a good thing, especially considering this is the hardest Final Fantasy game. While there are a few new OST compositions in Rhapsodies, and a couple excellent new zones, including Reisenjima, a location we heard about way back in Chains of Promathia and are finally able to visit, for the most part Rhapsodies is revisiting previous areas and characters, in many ways acting like a victory lap for the player after all they've accomplished, and lengthwise it is about the length of one of the expansions. Rhapsodies did also introduce some new battlefield content as well. Difficulty-wise, Rhapsodies is on par with Adoulin, where you can solo most of it, but will likely need help for a couple of the endgame bosses. There's some great new gear you can get by doing content introduced in this expansion, like Domain Invasion, but there's no new jobs or a new central hub city or anything like that. Still, what Rhapsodies brings to the table, it does excellently. It's a little cutscene heavy, but luckily the cutscenes are quite good. The story is compelling, full of twists and turns, leaving you on the edge of your seat to see what happens next. I won't spoil who the main villain is, but the final boss is the Cloud of Darkness. That's right, the Cloud of Darkness isn't just in Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy XIV, she's here as well, and she's a really excellent final boss for Final Fantasy XI. The music that plays during the fight is hauntingly beautiful, as instead of a big epic boss theme, it plays a bittersweet piano melody. As you battle the Cloud of Darkness, in the background, you can see flashes of your previous adventures in Vana'diel, really giving a grand sense of this being the end of Final Fantasy XI. After the final boss, there's a great cutscene with Iroha that serves as both a finale to her arc and also a statement from the developers to the players, expressing their appreciation for going on this journey and for all the years of support. It's touching, and then, for the first time in the game, Final Fantasy XI plays end credits. The song that plays during the credits sequence features the voices of actual 11 players on background vocals, ensuring they are enshrined in the game now and forever. It's a beautiful and grand send-off to 11. The story of Rhapsodies is about preventing the end of Vana'diel, so there's a tinge of bittersweetness in the ending, knowing that the story will, inevitably, someday come to an end. You could sense the devs felt this was their last chance to tell a grand Final Fantasy XI story, with service being shut down on consoles, and I'm sure they had fears that the PC version wouldn't be far behind. They put their heart and soul into the Rhapsodies content, and quite frankly, it's a beautiful artistic expression, and the vast majority of 11 fans agree with that sentiment. It's regarded highly by fans of the game, and even skeptics of Final Fantasy XI as a whole have admitted to finding themselves moved by the ending to Rhapsodies. Rhapsodies was meant to be the ending to Final Fantasy XI. It was meant to be a final chapter, a grand bookend to a grand narrative, and a love letter to those who helped make such a story possible to tell. While it might lack the mechanical depth of some of the other expansions, and might not tell as individually great a story as others, what it does incredibly well. Rhapsodies of Vana'diel helps tie the entirety of Final Fantasy XI into one experience, tells its own emotional story, and showcases just how much heart can be put into the video game medium. It's a fitting send-off to the game, and an excellent conclusion to one of the greatest Final Fantasy games. When Rhapsodies of Vana'diel was developed, the Final Fantasy XI staff assumed that the game was in its twilight years, and wouldn't remain as a live service game for much longer. With limited resources and budget, the staff was able to cobble together Rhapsodies as a final swan song to 11, and likely assumed the game wouldn't be able to continue supporting itself for much longer. But the fans of 11 remained loyal, and continued to pay their monthly subscription fees. Ironically, the newcomer-friendly additions to Rhapsodies did more to keep the game alive than to end it. But even as new players joined in on the game, resources continued to be moved away from Final Fantasy XI and onto other projects. As the 11 staff continued to face budget cuts, the devs moved mostly into maintenance mode with the game, only doing minor updates like adding some new battle challenges here or there, but there were no plans to do any major additions to the story because of how shoestring their budget was. And beyond that, Rhapsodies wrapped up everything so well, so why tell a new story? It's time to move on to the most recent, and as of today, final expansion of Final Fantasy XI. The Voracious Resurgence, initially released in 2020, is the final expansion to Final Fantasy XI. For some reason, the Wikipedia article on Final Fantasy XI lists Rhapsodies of Vana'diel as main scenario, and the Voracious Resurgence as an add-on scenario. Even though the Voracious Resurgence is ultimately longer than Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, has a larger OST than Rhapsodies, has its own battlefield content, and in order to play the Voracious Resurgence, you need to first beat the entirety of Rhapsodies, meaning it is a continuation of the main story. Semantic arguments among 11 fans are weird, but for all intents and purposes, the Voracious Resurgence is basically another Final Fantasy XI expansion, and it's been featured in a giant banner on the Final Fantasy XI website for the past 3 years, as the crown jewel of new content in the game, in the same way that a new expansion would be. It has its own freaking soundtrack. It's an expansion, semantics be damned. So, what's the deal with the Voracious Resurgence? Why is this a thing? Wasn't Final Fantasy XI on maintenance mode after the release of Rhapsodies of Vana'diel? Yes. Rhapsodies was meant to be the finale to Final Fantasy XI, and there were no plans, at all, to make any new story content for FF11. And then COVID-19 happened. It was a dark time for a lot of people, and the Final Fantasy XI staff wanted to do something that would make fans of the game happy, and they thought what was better to do than to add an entirely new expansion storyline to the game, complete with new characters, new music, new lore that builds upon previously established ideas, new gear, and new battlefield content. Despite having limited resources and no demands from higher-ups in the company, the devs, particularly Matsui, stated they wanted to do something for the fans to help get them through this tough time, and thus they released the first new story content the game had seen since Rhapsodies. Matsui really loves and cares for Final Fantasy XI, and has stated for years after Rhapsodies he wished he could do another expansion, and with the COVID-19 pandemic, Matsui finally found himself pushed over the edge where the desire to create could no longer be tamed. However, Final Fantasy XI now had an even smaller skeleton crew, and far fewer resources than they did when they made Rhapsodies, and in order to make content with the level of quality the devs wanted, it meant that the Voracious Resurgence had to be released in updates, which is nothing new for Final Fantasy XI, as previous expansions had story updates after their initial release. But the Voracious Resurgence updates were small, and came out over the course of a 3-year period, finally reaching the end of the storyline in 2023. It was a compromise the devs made, to release in small batches or not to release at all. When I came into playing the Voracious Resurgence in 2022, about maybe half of the expansion had been released by that point, so while I could marathon the first chunk of the expansion, I had to wait for updates to finish the rest. But I have finished it all, and players are now able to play through the entirety of the Voracious Resurgence as a full expansion storyline without any need to wait for updates from the devs. The fact that they were able to pull this off with their limited resources is a small miracle, and the fact that it's really good is even more impressive. The story of the Voracious Resurgence revolves around mysterious eggs that have begun to appear around Vana'diel. Beastmen legends state that these eggs carry within them the power to destroy the world. Our player adventurer investigates these mysterious World Eater eggs while combating against the Destiny Destroyers, a trio of beastmen seeking the eggs, and Uran Mafran, a magician seeking to revive his master, Maelstrom mage Aht Urghan, who nearly destroyed the world 300 years prior. Our adventurer hero discovers that trouble is brewing in the land of the dead and needs to prevent the forces of chaos from destroying the cycle of life and rebirth. The story of the Voracious Resurgence begins very slowly, and the premise seems weak upon first glance. The follow-up to the insanely epic Rhapsodies of Vana'diel time travel plot is that some weird eggs are showing up in Vana'diel, and hey, you better check out what's going on with those weird eggs. It feels more calm, more mundane, more of a return to normalcy, but that's actually the point of the expansion. It's very much a slow burn, and while it starts off very light, the stakes do gradually build, and it does become extremely epic by the end of the journey. Voracious was clearly meant to be a foil to Rhapsodies, to not just be a repeat of it, and that makes sense. There was no way Voracious could outdo Rhapsodies as an ending to the game, so instead of trying to be better than it, Voracious tried to be different. There's a much heavier focus on comedy and light-hearted moments than Rhapsodies, and there's a better gameplay to cutscene ratio too. It plays differently and has its own distinct rhythm, in a good way. Like Rhapsodies, you'll be traveling around the world revisiting a lot of significant NPCs, and it's actually pretty cool seeing their stories continue after all these years. You'll also be encountering some new faces, and the stories involved in them are pretty strong as well. The first half of the Voracious Resurgence feels a bit more episodic in format. You hear about a mysterious egg and go investigate, you help a local character with a problem they are facing, and you continue to try to unravel the secrets of the eggs. The individual stories are all pretty good, but the overarching narrative feels a bit disconnected, and it can be difficult to get your finger on the pulse of the narrative rhythm for the first chunk of the expansion. The second half is much more focused, with a clearer through line, but both halves are thoroughly enjoyable. There are some very well-written and very significant additions to Final Fantasy XI lore added in this expansion, to the point where I'm impressed at how well they are able to build upon established ideas from 20 years ago without making it seem like another writer has taken over. The fact that I was able to learn new things about the Valkyr race and Odin in this expansion is pretty freaking cool. Also, we've got a new expansion girl. Kinda. Meet the Gloom Phantom, a goblin who leads a trio of beastmen called the Destiny Destroyers, who seek to save the world from the threat of the World Eater eggs. This is the first time we have a Beastman expansion girl. She's not really treated like a love interest for our hero, and she does act as an antagonist initially. But she's female, she's the deuteragonist, she eventually works with our hero, and develops a close relationship with him. She acts narratively as a party member, propels the plot forward, and gets a ton of screen time. She's an expansion girl. Let me know your favorite expansion girl in the comments. I want to see all the Gloom Phantom simps out there. Joking aside, Gloom Phantom is another great addition to the Final Fantasy XI cast, as are her companions Mag Bihu and Dazbog. The villains of this expansion are particularly memorable as well. Uran Mafran is a great recurring antagonist, and is one of the toughest opponents I've faced in all of Final Fantasy XI. His master, Aht Urghan, is an intimidating presence, and is built up incredibly well throughout the expansion story. If you don't count Shantotto, this is the first time we've had a Tarutaru as a main antagonist in an expansion story, and it's cool to see that. There's also a great final boss in the form of, spoilers, Chaos. That's right, we've got an FF1 callback and FF11 after all these years, and the boss fights against Chaos are pretty damn epic, with some great music too. The soundtrack for the Voracious Resurgence is excellent. I've really come to appreciate Naoshi Mizuda's music, playing through all of Final Fantasy XI and other games he's worked on like Final Fantasy Dimensions 1 and 2, Final Fantasy 13-2, and Final Fantasy 15's episode Prompto. The man is an unsung hero in the FF community, and the fact that he's been steadily providing great music to Final Fantasy XI since 2001 is worthy of a salute. The music to 11 has been consistently amazing, and the fact that he provided us with a whole new, awesome soundtrack for this expansion after all these years is simply tremendous. Absolutely an unsung hero of the series. The Voracious Resurgence might have more gameplay than Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, but that's only because Rhapsodies was really cutscene heavy, while Voracious is a bit more balanced. It's not an FF5 situation where the story takes a backseat to the gameplay, but rather there's both plenty of story and plenty of gameplay in this expansion. While there are no new areas to explore, the Voracious Resurgence offers creative use of older areas to make the experience feel like a full expansion in terms of length and narrative. Let's talk a little bit about gameplay. The Voracious Resurgence is by far the hardest main story content in any Final Fantasy game. You might be able to beat a couple of the early bosses on your own, but for the vast majority of this expansion, you're going to want to party up whenever you engage in a boss battle. The level of difficulty makes sense, given that the devs assume you've beaten the rest of Final Fantasy XI by this point, and Final Fantasy XI is already the hardest Final Fantasy game. So, it's an expansion that's difficult even by Final Fantasy XI standards. It's not the hardest content in the entire series, but it is definitely the hardest main story content in the entire series. Another important aspect of the gameplay is the battlefield content added for the Voracious Resurgence called Sortie. Playing through Sortie is a requirement to beat the expansion. There's a special kind of currency you'll need called Gallimaufry for a certain mission, and the only way to get this currency is by playing through Sortie content. It's difficult, high-level content, and you need a lot of Gallimaufry for the mission. Sortie has a 1-hour time limit once you enter, and you can only enter Sortie once per day, at least at the time of this video. It's extremely popular in 11 right now because Sortie is also where players are grinding to obtain high-level gear, so there is often a queue to get in. And if you're trying to play Sortie during a busier time of day, you might find yourself waiting 20 minutes just to get in. For me, playing solo, it took me about 2 weeks of logging in once a day to get the required amount of Gallimaufry to complete the mission that required it. So for those counting at home, that's 20 hours of MMO grinding. That's the length of Chrono Trigger. It's the only grindy part of this expansion, and it's not bad when you break it up into a daily thing, but I felt it's worth mentioning as a downside to the Voracious Resurgence. When the game is updating story once every other month anyway, logging in for an hour a day to do some battling isn't that bad. But for those marathoning this expansion, I imagine it would be a momentum killer, and I hope the devs add a faster way to get the amount of Gallimaufry required to complete that particular Voracious mission. Overall, the Voracious Resurgence is a good expansion to Final Fantasy XI. It's not one of the best ones, it's not one of the worst ones, it's basically right in the middle. It has a good story that adds to 11's lore and fits in with the established tone of the game very well. It doesn't feel like an ending to the entire history of 11 in the way that Rhapsodies does, and instead just feels like another fun Final Fantasy XI expansion. But again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's very good, and there's a lot to like about it. Towards the end of the Voracious Resurgence, Akihiko Matsui stepped down as producer as he transitioned Yoji Fujito into the producer role, though Matsui did continue to lead the Voracious Resurgence up until its finale. It's bittersweet to see Matsui go, and Fujito doesn't seem to have any plans or desires to develop more main story content for 11. Matsui had a passion for main story content, while Fujito seems to be more focused on just keeping a steady ship, which is a fair way to approach a live service game, but under his new leadership, the updates have become even smaller than before. I don't blame him, as I understand the limited budget and resources he is being given, but I do admire that Matsui found a way to make magic happen despite the hand he was given, and it's a shame he is no longer at the helm because it's clear he has such a passion for the game. It's unclear what the future of Final Fantasy XI holds, and it's very possible that the Voracious Resurgence is the last main story content we'll ever see from the game. But then again, people have been thinking that back since 2007, so honestly, I have no idea. What I do know is that even if there is never any new story content in Final Fantasy XI, the story content that is there is wonderful, and I'm so glad I played through all of it. As a mega fan of the Final Fantasy series, I can safely say that after going through all of Final Fantasy XI, as a story-first player, it is one of my favorite games in the series, and one of my favorite video games of all time. It's an incredible experience, and I hope that, if you've never played 11, I was able to share with you a glimpse of what the game is and what makes it so great. And now, onto the bonus section of the video, Greg's FF11 tips. For those of you who watched all of this and thought to yourself, you know what, 11 actually seems pretty cool, I want to give it a shot, I've got some beginner pointers that will help start you off on your Vana'diel journey. Let it be stated I'm not an expert on mechanics. I don't have all the stats for the game memorized, and I'm very much a player who doesn't like grinding for top tier equipment, or anything like that. I like to do the bare minimum needed to play through the main story comfortably. I'm less about min-maxing, and more about getting the ball rolling and having fun. These are tips I've shared with other new players in FF11 Facebook groups, and is basically just a list of things I keep in a Word doc that I figured I might as well put in this video. And it's mostly unedited, the same stuff I've sent to other players asking for help dozens of times. A lot of these are general tips, so you might need to do a little additional research for exact specifics based upon what nation you're in, and you might need to look up some specifics on where certain things I mention are, but it's a good starting point. So, here are a few tips I have for players looking to try Final Fantasy XI for the first time. When playing through Final Fantasy XI, I went with a red mage as my main job and black mage as my sub job. It's a useful combo because you get options for almost any situation you will find yourself in while playing Final Fantasy XI. You get decent physical attacks, white magic, and black magic, all of which is versatile for the majority of the game. Red Mage is a weaker class overall, but with Trust and item level gear, you can solo most of the game comfortably without needing to level up a different class for every scenario. Red Mage also has useful abilities like Sneak and Invisible, which allows you to avoid a lot of fights, and if you sub Black Mage, you can get Warp, which is super useful for getting out of dungeons. You also definitely want to max out your job level and your sub job. If you max out your sub job, you'll gain significant stat bonuses and gain abilities from the sub job, stacked on top of your main job, at half the level of your main job. If you want to solo Final Fantasy XI, you'll want to have the wiki open at pretty much all times on another computer or phone. The locations of quest items and such is really obtuse, so you will want a guide at all times when going through the story. BG Wiki is probably the best one. You will want to unlock Records of Eminence immediately, like as soon as you start playing. There are quests you can activate in the menu, many of which are repeatable, and they offer both EXP bonuses and special reward items upon completion. There are daily Records of Eminence you can do that will reward you with copper vouchers, which you can trade into an NPC for various currencies. Equip an EXP ring to level up faster. The effects don't automatically take effect once you equip the ring though. You have to have the item equipped and then go into your menu and use it as an item for it to take effect, which is something I didn't know for the longest time. If it runs out of charge, don't worry, it can be recharged by an NPC. Join a Unity Concord immediately. Go with Apuru. Joining a Unity Concord gives you a free trust and a bunch of useful teleports, as well as reports as to where the domain invasion is currently occurring. Apuru is a really good healer trust, and you'll want a healer trust for soloing. Check for login campaigns on the Play Online site for trusts, aka NPC summons, as there are certain times where you'll be able to obtain a lot of really useful trusts all at once. There are also Records of Eminence trusts that you can get right away. Make sure you get them, as they will greatly help you on your journey. Touch every teleport crystal and floating teleport book you come across. Unlock mounts as soon as you can, it'll save you time. Do the Rhapsodies missions. The bonuses you get are too good to pass up, like the ability to summon extra trusts and reduce the cost of teleportation. Grind your main job to 99 and your sub job to 55. You will have to do limit break quests to unlock higher levels, and that will be some of the hardest solo content you'll do. But if you can get to level 99, you'll plow through most of the main story. Once you're at level 99, go to Adoulin and buy some item level 119 gear. Adoulin has a currency called Bailed. You can trade copper vouchers for Bailed to buy the gear. Item level 119 gear will make you and your trust stronger. You'll eventually want better 119 gear, but this will get you through most of the game. Once you get the ability to do Domain Invasion, which you unlock through playing Rhapsodies, start doing that once per day, and you can trade the currency from doing Domain Invasion for item level 119 gear in a place called Norg, which you'll have unlocked by that point. It's good level 119 gear that will help you get over the hurdles that the Adoulin level 119 gear won't get you past. And it doesn't take too long to do. Maybe like 10 minutes a day, and in a month or so, you'll have a full set of good level 119 gear. Not amazing, there's better 119 gear out there, but it's better than the Adoulin stuff. Probably don't start in Windurst. It's hard mode, even if the story is better. But if you're super into story, maybe go back and do Windurst after you do one of the other nations. As far as servers go, I recommend Bahamut. It's the second most popular server, and the community is really great. Ashura is more popular, but a lot of the players there are more hardcore, and oftentimes when you ask for help, other players will want you to pay them in gil, so the people there are a bit more mercenary. Whereas players in Bahamut will help you just to be nice and have fun. The vibes are good on Bahamut, at least at the time of writing this video. Buy all the maps you can as soon as you can. If you need money, you can use Sparks of Eminence, which you gain from doing Records of Eminence, to buy Archeon's shields, which sell for 26,000 gil. If you need quick fame in Adoulin, repeat the quest It Sets My Heart Aflutter, A Good Pair of Crocs, and A Shot in the Dark. I'll have a link for this and for a Rhapsodies mission list in the description and pinned comment. And finally, here's my list of leveling spots, as found on Reddit, posted by a user named Chicken Sandwich, which I found to be a really good list. I'll leave in their commentary and supplement it with my own. Levels 1 through 15, Ronfaure, Sarutabaruta, or Gustaberg, depending on whichever your start nation is, just fight whatever is outside of town. Levels 15 through 25, Valkurm Dunes, at either West E9/F9 or East H9I9, Beach. Fight crabs until level 18, then add in Pugils. Levels 25 through 32. Quoofem Island. Here you will fight some worms and some crabs. Sounds gross saying that out loud. 8-7 is a good place to camp. Just beware of ghosts at night. Levels 32 through 46. Garlaz Citadel. Here you will fight bats and beetles. These are all on the first map. Just make a loop around the first area between G/H/I8 and I/H/G9 and you will be good. Levels 46 through 55. Boston New Oublet. Here you will fight bats. Drop down into the sewer, map 1, E8, and stay in the first L-shaped hallway. Be careful of the Hedicom Hound in the middle at H7, and don't go past the 4 werebats at G7. Levels 55 through 65. Wajome Woodlands. Fight the Lesser Colibri at the lay point in the middle of the map, G8. This will require you unlocking Treasures of Aht Urghan. Levels 65 through 70. The Boyada Tree. You will want to fight Processionaires on map 3 at H9/I9/H10/I10. The fastest way here is from the home point crystal near the Cloister of Storms, after which you'll make a left along the southwest wall from map 2. If you have trouble understanding what this means, just look up some stuff in the wikis, it'll make sense. Man, this video is already super long, just take the tips and roll with it. Levels 70 through 82. Baflau Thickets. Mamulja Staging Point. You can basically fight whatever is hanging around here. You will need to trek through Mamook to unlock this area, which is a pain in the butt. However, it's worth it for the grinding spot. Maybe ask for help getting through Mamook. There's a home point here as well. It's also a Treasures of Aht Urghan area, so you will need to unlock it by this point. Levels 82 through 87. Mount Zalom. Here you'll fight some Orkealcum Shell. To unlock, go to the Nazul Staging Point exit, take F5 to Helvung, which is a straight tunnel to Mount Zalom. The crabs are just outside, and there's a home point at D8. It's also a Treasures of Aht Urghan area. Levels 87 through 89. Czak Battlegrounds. Fight the Blance Mandragora. J7, J8, J9, just outside of town. This is a Seekers of Adoulin area, so that means you will need to unlock that expansion. And there you go! My list of beginner tips for starting off in Final Fantasy XI. I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with my beginner tips and argue I've left out some very important things, which I get. 11 has a lot of systems to keep track of, and it helps to go in with a game plan. But I feel the stuff I listed here is a good launching point for you to figure out how you want to approach the game. Well, that was certainly a long video, and there's still a lot of stuff I completely glossed over. If I did a deep dive into each story, each major character, each piece of Battlefield content, man, it's crazy to think of how long that video would be. Just doing brief overviews of all this content made for a massive video. If you want some more information on 11 from a story perspective, I found a great channel called Vicenarian that is going through all of the expansions and reviewing them, and those videos are incredible. Definitely check those out if you want a deeper dive into more 11 content. I found that channel while in the process of making this video, and I subbed immediately. Seriously, those videos are absolutely incredible, check them out. Also, account setup can be a bit tricky, so I'll link a video from Call Me Quetch that helps explain that process. Trust me, signing up for Final Fantasy XI is harder than you might think it is, and you will want a video guide for that. As you can tell, there is a lot of video game in Final Fantasy XI, and me summing up the expansions in this way is just the tip of the iceberg. Yes, there's a lot of video game in Final Fantasy XI, but more than that, there's a lot of great story that goes underappreciated by the average FF fan, and I hope I was able to help convey a bit of what the game has to offer you. There aren't really any videos I've seen that discuss each expansion, aside from Vicenarian, who is great, check him out. But there's not a video that discusses the entirety of Final Fantasy XI in a single video, so I hope I was able to highlight the expansions to you in a way that you found interesting. I very much recommend playing Final Fantasy XI, but if you want to just check out the story, the YouTube channel Korvana has cutscenes for the entire game, minus the Voracious Resurgence. I'll link that as well. Maybe Vicenarian will be nice and put all the cutscenes for the Voracious Resurgence up when they get around to playing that expansion. Or maybe if a bunch of people flood Korvana's channel, Korvana will finally upload those videos. Definitely give Korvana a sub too. The work archiving all of the game's story is a huge contribution to the 11 community. In fact, watching Korvana's videos is what made me want to play Final Fantasy XI. I ended up just watching the cutscenes here and there because I figured I would never have the time to actually play through the game, but the story for the cutscenes was so good I decided to play through the entirety of it just because I knew exactly what I was getting into. A great story. Final Fantasy XI is one of 3 Final Fantasies where I've watched all of the cutscenes before playing the game. This, Final Fantasy XV, and Final Fantasy XVI. And I did like playing through the game and experiencing those cutscenes a second time, but with the context of all the added gameplay in between. It made for a really excellent experience. But again, if you're like, nah, this still sounds too grindy, you can always watch the Korvana cutscenes. Final Fantasy XI is a great game. It can be hard, it can be brutal, it can be grindy, but it has a lot of heart, and I love it. Let me know if you plan on checking out Final Fantasy XI or have any questions about something I didn't cover in the video that you want my opinion on. For fans of the game, what's your favorite expansion? Let's get the discussion going in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Wishing you peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!